Hello and welcome everyone to the Scouring of Germany, the cultural legacy of the Allied bombing, the third part of what ultimately occurred to be a trilogy, a very miserable trilogy or a mini-series of episodes. And I don't think I have the heart to continue with these cultural devastation episodes, so this is likely going to be the last one. I am very lucky to be joined this evening by Alexander Adams. Hello.
Hello, AM. Hello, chat.
Now, I'm very unfortunately, Dee has had to pull out. So there is a likelihood that maybe in an hour's time or later on in this conversation, Dee will be returning to us and will be able to listen to his various insights. But for now, it's just going to be the two of us. I've structured this conversation around two books that you can find in the description. One is W.G. Sebald's On the Natural History of Destruction, which has focused on the literary accounts in German of the Feuersturm, which I've used here in the thumbnail, or the firestorm of the bombing of Germany. Another title I had for this episode was Kulturmord, the culture killer. But I ultimately ended up thinking that the firestorm, especially if you look at that painting of Dresden in the background, seemed more appropriate. Another book, which was not recently, but 20 years ago, translated into English, was Der Brand, or The Fire, the bombing of Germany, 1940 to 1945. Very interesting enough, that was written by one Jörg Friedrich, and he was quite a well-known lefty historian until all of a sudden he wrote this book, became very popular, and was more or less sort of anathematized by German intellectuals so for writing about this topic. But I want to start this stream by reading a segment from On the Natural History of Destruction. And as with all of these episodes, Alexander, if you would like to bring up any points at all, please do interrupt me. And I will no doubt interrupt myself as I'm reading this passage. So are we okay?
That sounds good. Yeah.
All right. In spite of strenuous efforts to come to terms with the past, as people like to put it, it seems to me that we Germans today are a nation strikingly blind to history and lacking in tradition. We do not feel any passionate interest in our early way of life and the specific features of our own civilization, of the kind universally perceptible, for instance, in the culture of the British Isles. And when we turn to take a backward view, particularly of the years 1930 to 1950, we are always looking away at the same time. As a result, the works produced by German authors after the war are often marked by a half-consciousness or false consciousness, designed to consolidate the extremely precarious position of those writers in a society that was almost entirely discredited morally. To the overwhelming majority of the writers who stayed in Germany under the Third Reich, the redefinition of their idea of themselves after 1945 was a more urgent business than the depiction of the real conditions surrounding them. The case of A. Anders was a good example of the unfortunate consequences in literary practice, and for that reason, the essay on him, which I published a few years ago, will be reprinted here. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go into that specific essay. At the time, it earned me several sharp reprimands from people unwilling to see that as the apparently inexorable power of the fascist regime was deployed, a basic stance of opposition and lively intelligence, characteristics undoubtedly typical of Anderich, could easily turn into more or less deliberate attempts to conform, and the latter, a man in the eyes of like Anderich, would therefore have to adjust his presentation of his career through tactful omission and other revisions. In my view, such a preoccupation and retrospective improvement of the self-image they wished to hand down was one of the main reasons for the inability of a whole generation of German authors to describe what they had seen and to convey it to our minds. Today, it is hard to form an even partly adequate idea of the extent of the devastation suffered by the cities of Germany in the last years of the Second World War. Still harder to think about the horrors involved in that devastation. It is true that strategic bombing surveys published by the Allies, together with the records of the Federal German Statistics Office and other official sources, show that the Royal Air Force alone dropped 1 million tons of bombs on enemy territory. It is true that of the 131 towns and cities attacked, some only once and some repeatedly, many were almost entirely flattened, that about 600,000 German civilians were killed in the air raids and 3.5 million homes were destroyed, while at the end of the war, 7.5 million people were left homeless, and there was ultimately 31.13 cubic meters of rubble for everyone in Cologne and 43 cubic meters for every inhabitant of Dresden. But we do not grasp what this all actually meant. The destruction on a scale without historic precedent entered the annals of a nation as it set about rebuilding itself only in the form of vague generalizations. It seems to have left scarcely a trace of pain behind in the collective consciousness. It has been largely obliterated from the retrospective understanding of those affected, and it never played any appreciable part in the discussion of the internal constitution of our country. As A. Kluger later confirmed, it never became an experience capable of public decipherment. This is highly paradoxical in view of the large numbers of people exposed to the campaign day after day, month after month, year after year, and the length of time well into the post-war period during which they still faced its real consequences, which might have been expected to stifle any positive attitude to life in general. Despite the enormous efforts whereby some kind of practical modus vivendi was restored after every attack, even after 1950, wooden crosses still stood on the piles of rubble in the towns like Pforzheim, which lost almost 1/3 of its 60,000 inhabitants in a single raid on the night of the 22nd of February, 1945. And no doubt the dreadful smells, which, as J. Flanner wrote in March of 1947, were released into the yawning cellars of Warsaw by the first warm spring weather, also pervaded the German cities in the immediate post-war period. But these things obviously did not register on the sensory experience of the survivors still living at the scene of the catastrophe. People walked down the street and past the dreadful ruins, wrote A. Doblin in 1945, after returning from American exile to southwest Germany, as if nothing had happened, and the town had already looked like that. The reverse side of such apathy was a declaration of a new beginning, the unquestioning heroism with which people immediately set about the task of clearance and reorganization. A booklet devoted to the city of Worms in 1945-55 says the hour called for upright men of impeccable conduct and aims, almost all of whom would be in the front line of reconstruction for years to come. This booklet, written by one Willy Rupert for the municipal authorities, included many photographs, including 2 pictures of the Kemmerstrasse. They made it look as if the image of total destruction was not the horrifying end of a collective aberration, but something more like the first stage of a brave new world. Writing of a conversation with the directors of IG Farben in Frankfurt, Robert Thomas Pell recalls the amazement with which he heard Germans stating their intention of rebuilding their country to be greater and stronger than ever before, in a tone in which self-pity, groveling, self-justification, a sense of injured innocence, and defiance were curiously intermingled. Nor did they subsequently fail to carry out that intention, as witness the postcards that travellers in Germany can buy today on the newsstands of Frankfurt am Main. From the outset, the now legendary and in some respects genuinely admirable reconstruction of this country after the devastation wrought by Germany's wartime enemies, a reconstruction tantamount to a second liquidation in successive phases of the nation's own past history, prohibited any backward view. It did so through the sheer amount of labor required and the creation of a new faceless reality, pointing the population exclusively towards the future and enjoining on it silence about the past. German accounts of the time, which is scarcely a generation ago, are so few and so far between that Hans Magnus Enzensberger's collection, Europa in Trümmern, Europe in Ruins, published in 1990, consists predominantly of pieces by foreign journalists and writers making observations that until then had been almost completely ignored in Germany. The few accounts originally written in Germany are by former exiles or other outsiders such as Max Frisch. Those who had stayed in Germany, like Walter von Molo and Frank Thies, in the deplorable controversy over Thomas Mann, were fond of saying that while others were comfortably ensconced in America, they themselves had not left their homeland in its hour of need, refrained entirely from commenting on the process and outcome of destruction, probably not least for fear that accurate descriptions might get them into trouble with the occupying forces. Contrary to popular opinion, this shortage of contemporary accounts was not compensated for in post-war German literature, which, as it followed a deliberate program of renewal after 1947, might have been expected to cast some light on the real state of affairs. Whilst the old guard of the so-called internal emigrants claimed to have been engaged in passive resistance, invoking, as Enzensberger notes, vague notions of freedom and the humanist inheritances of the West in endless and prolix abstractions, the younger generation of writers who had just returned home were so intent on their own wartime experiences, described in a style constantly lapsing into maudlin sentimentality, that they hardly seemed to notice the horrors which at that time surrounded them on all sides. Even the frequently cited literature of the ruins, of its nature, presupposing an unerring sense of reality, and chiefly concerned, as H. Bull acknowledged, with what we found when we came home, proves on closer inspection to be an instrument already tuned to individual and collective amnesia, and probably influenced by a pre-conscious self-censorship, a means of obscuring a world that could no longer be presented in comprehensible terms. There was a tacit agreement, equally binding on everyone, that the true state of material and moral ruin in which the country found itself was not to be described. The darkest aspects of the final act of destruction, as experienced by the great majority of the German population, remained under a kind of taboo, like a shameful family secret, a secret that perhaps could not even be privately acknowledged. Even in later years, when local and amateur war historians began documenting the fall of German cities, their studies did not alter the fact that the images of this horrifying chapter of our history have never really crossed the threshold of the national consciousness. Those compilations, as a rule published by more or less obscure firms, Hans Brunswick's Firestorm over Hamburg, for instance, was issued in 1978 by Motorbuch Verlag of Stuttgart, often seemed curiously untouched by the subject of their research and served primarily to sanitize or eliminate a kind of knowledge incompatible with any sense of normality. They did not try to provide a clearer understanding of the extraordinary faculty for self-anesthesia shown by a community that seemed to have emerged from a war of annihilation without any signs of psychological impairment. The almost entire absence of profound disturbance to the inner life of the nation suggests that the new federal German society relegated the experiences of its own prehistory to the back of its mind and developed an almost perfectly functioning mechanism of repression, one which allowed it to recognize the fact of its own rise from total degradation, while disengaging entirely from its stock of emotions, if not actually chalking up as another item to its credit its success in overcoming all tribulations without showing any signs of weakness. Enzensberger points out that it is impossible to understand the mysterious energy of the Germans if we refuse to realize that they have made a virtue of their own deficiencies. Insensibility, he adds, was the condition of their success. The prerequisites of the German economic miracle were not only the enormous sums invested in the country under the Marshall Plan, the outbreak of the Cold War, and the scrapping of the outdated industrial complexes, an operation performed with brutal efficiency by the bomber squadrons, but also something less often acknowledged, the unquestioning work ethic learned in a totalitarian society, the logistical capacity, the improvisation shown by an economy under constant threat, experiences in the use of foreign labor forces, and the lifting of the heavy burden of history that went up in flames between 1942 and 1945. Along with the centuries-old buildings accommodating homes and businesses in Nuremberg and Cologne, in Frankfurt, Aachen, Brunswick, Wolfsburg, a historical burden ultimately regretted by only a few. And in addition to these more or less identifiable factors in the genesis of the economic miracle, there was also a purely immaterial catalyst, the stream of psychic energy that had not dried up to this day, and which had its source in the well-kept secret of the corpses built into the foundation of our state, a secret that bound all Germans together in the post-war years, and indeed still binds them more closely than any positive goals, such as the realization of democracy. So, Alexander, before I sort of elaborate my own sort of thoughts on this, is there anything you would like to bring up on that passage?
Yes, I would say that I think part of the German acceptance of the bombing, or the sort of the absence of mourning or outrage, I think it sort of comes from, I think it stems from a sense of the collective guilt, that if they were responsible, if they were sort of branded as collectively responsible for the war, and these horrors were also visited upon, mainly the sort of the adjoining nations of France, and particularly Poland and Russia, that they had no right to complain, because these had been experienced also by these others, and that as people who had initiated the war, as it was seen retrospectively, they couldn't, they had no sort of legitimate grounds for complaint. That's my thought. And also I would say that maybe people were more interested in talking about their families and what had happened to because obviously any of the families that were split up over the division between the Soviet zone and the other occupied zones was quite dramatic, because it had the effect of splitting up families. And so I think that this was this was an immediate concern. This was something that was pressing from the last months of the war, and would continue pressing for the next sort of 40 or 50 years, until the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I think that was shaping a lot of people's reactions, beyond obviously grieving for relatives and grieving for the cultural destruction, maybe.
Well, I mean, not just the destruction, but you mentioned the families themselves. I mean, that theme you've brought up about, you can say, this inertia of the focus to the immediate relatives and one's immediate surroundings, and individually sort of getting through this experience. I mean, there's a mirror here with what happened in the East and the mass exodus of Germans accompanying the Soviet advance. Not only were the German cities themselves destroyed, but all of a sudden these ruined cities were now home to millions of German refugees who had been, either they had fled before the Soviets, or they had been forcibly expelled by the Soviets during the period of occupation, 1945 to 1949. And of course, bringing back this idea of conscious self-censorship and this idea of pragmatism or insensibility regarding the past, of course, this is the consequence of not only having those cities razed to the ground, of having been a defeated power, but having been a consistently occupied power throughout the entire experience. So it's not only a process of destruction, but it's also a process of oblivion, that the cities, the civilization that resulted in these cities, everything that came before, needed to be consigned to the ash heap in a literal sense, in order to build a new future that was, you can say, acceptable to this impulse to westernize the remnant of Germany, the German Federal Republic, into what would later become NATO and the EEC, European Economic Community, which would ultimately evolve into the European Union. And only that way could this destruction and this following period of oblivion cleanse Germany. And indeed, you can see these references over and over again, that this was, as you mentioned, seen as a moral act by the Allies, if not an act of sort of moral sort of condemnation, represented by God's judgment, or, you know, the fires of hell being visited on these cities. All of these sort of aspects intermingling as to trying to explain this, what I've always felt to be this bizarre collective feeling regarding the destruction of Germany. Because, of course, in Britain, albeit this is very much under continuous strain at the moment, one is allowed a hint of nationalism in certain respects. Funnily enough, it's now being relegated to things like Arthur Harris's bombing campaign. But of course, this is an act of not just the destruction of the cities, but also an act of a collective amnesia about the past, as Sebald points out very cogently. I think it would be useful before continuing, because this excerpt brings up a lot of the themes emanating from the Feuersturm, the firebombing of Germany, but I want to explain a bit of the historical logistics of how we came to this point. So obviously, Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. They commenced bombings of various urban centers, Warsaw. It wasn't the first major civilian bombing raids of history. The main civilian bombing raids were in the east, in the Sino-Japanese War, the bombing of Shanghai. There were also smaller civilian bombing raids in Spain during the Spanish Civil Wars, and there were indeed civilian bombing raids even further back with the Zeppelin raids in World War I, which actually had a significant significant effect rather, on British strategy devisers in the interwar period, which bears some mentioning here.
Yes, so, that's right. Yeah. Yes, should mention that the Zeppelin raids made a huge impact on people, and the amount of destruction and deaths that resulted from that was relatively small. But it was a psychological thing to see these giant airships above the city that was largely unprepared and relatively undefended. And there were a number of sort of notable bombings, and I know that they were sort of they bombed the embankment and stuff. So there are still scars on that sort of Egyptian monument on the embankment in London that were left deliberately. I think so. I think that a lot of people realized that there would be an air war, and so this made a strong impact on people, even beyond the destruction that was caused.
Well, I find this very interesting and a bit of a counterpoint, because the Allies, of course, innovated when it came to tank warfare in the First World War, but it would be the Germans who innovated in the interwar, and they would become masters of Bewegungskrieg, movement warfare, combined with Sturmpanzer and Blitzkrieg, utilizing small mobile detachments of panzers to quickly envelop and break through enemy lines. So it seems to me that the Germans, who were pioneers of air warfare, civilian bombing during the First World War, had the similar effect on British policymakers. During the 1920s, the idea of strategic bombing campaigns as a way of subduing future enemies of the British Empire developed into a coherent policy called Trenchardism, after, I believe, Air Marshal Trenchard, who was chief of the RAF up until 1932. So this is even before Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. The prospect of Britain becoming involved in a strategic bombing campaign was very far advanced in the strategic makeup of the Royal Air Force, partly because the experience of World War I had convinced the entire sort of, not just the military apparatus, but the entire political makeup of the United Kingdom to avoid a similar system of trench warfare and mass slaughter that was incurred in the First World War. So this idea of defeating an enemy from afar using strategic bombing raids, where one suffered casualties in the dozens rather than the tens of thousands, seemed very appealing. Indeed, if you look at the period of the Phoney War, it seems that all such strategies coming out of France and Britain were focusing on keeping the war as far away from a recreation of the Western Front as possible. So we see these plans they were developed with Neville Chamberlain, but they never really came to anything, this idea of a sustained period of strategic bombing. Indeed, when you look at the idea of expanding the war to include the Soviet Union after Stalin invaded Finland in the Winter War, we see plans to destroy major Soviet infrastructure and the Soviet oil supplies at Baku, etc. So this idea of keeping the war away from a recreation of trench warfare and using strategic bombing is something very well advanced by the 1930s. And there's a prophetic remark indeed where Stanley Baldwin, the then prime minister from 1935 onwards, touts the idea of the destructive capability that could be wrought with the new strategic bombing doctrine. Nevertheless, it is the Luftwaffe that are the first to actually utilize these policies en masse in Europe. They do so in targeting civilian areas in Poland. Within 5 weeks, Poland has surrendered. And when we see the beginning of the invasion of the Benelux and France in May and June of 1940, the Germans use strategic bombing of civilian areas to compel, say, for example, the Dutch government to surrender with the civilian bombing of Rotterdam. After France falls and Western Europe is occupied by the Germans, the French surrender. The Battle of Britain is almost sidetracked by the Blitz, which is the morale bombing of London and various other cities from 1940 to mid-1941. So the Germans, despite having an air force which is dedicated to tactical bombing, as in associating themselves with a land war, essentially. The army moves forward, and the air force is there to facilitate military operations on the ground. The Germans are trying to utilize the Luftwaffe also as a strategic bombing unit, and they're not very successful in this endeavor, which helps explain why the Germans lost the Battle of Britain. So really, it takes the Allies adopting this policy in 1942 to really see how extreme this idea of incendiary bombing, mass bombing of civilian areas using in excess of 1,000 bombers in certain instances, to see how far one can go with this doctrine. So at the beginning of 1942, the Soviets have been attacked by Germany. The Germans are at Leningrad. They were at one point very close to Moscow, and there is Case Blue when they advance through southern Russia to attack Stalingrad. The Germans have by and large occupied Europe from Norway to the borders of Spain. And other than the war and talking about the Western Front, not getting involved with the Japanese war in the Far East, the British really couldn't do anything outside of the Desert Campaign against Rommel and the Afrika Korps. So the idea of strategic bombing was brought up again from Churchill's experience and the experience of the RAF from the Blitz, to be used as a weapon against Germany on an unimaginable scale compared to everything that had previously occurred. At the beginning of 1940, there is a famous bomber directive which basically sanctions the use of what is effectively unlimited aerial bombardment of Germany, including mass civilian areas. Indeed, part of this bomber directive expanded the scope of attack beyond that of precision bombing, i.e. targeting military installations, targeting factories, anything that could directly contribute to Germany's prosecution of the war, into mass civilian bombing raids, including a deliberate policy of dehousing the German population, which is a word that keeps coming up. The purpose of this new strategy was morale warfare. It was used to destroy the Germans' will to fight, which of course is something which is endemic to all warfare. But it's rather interesting here that the British decide to focus this campaign on targeting civilian areas en masse, with little distinction in terms of what is a genuine military target and what can be used to stir up the German population, potentially against the National Socialist government, which of course was the intention, to break the population and to turn them against Adolf Hitler. So that was the strategic justification. Indeed, it also needs to be taken into account that now the Americans are on side. They are funding the British in the war effort. They will eventually be able to fund bombers as well in the various bombing campaigns in Germany. That this is really one of the very few strategic options available to the Allies at this time. So all of these factors bring to the fore this idea of utilizing strategic bombing against Germany. But of course, on the one hand, you've had the Blitz, and the Germans have been demonized for bringing these horrors against the civilian population from Poland to the Benelux to Britain. And of course, during this time, there was, of course, the bombing of Coventry. And now the Allies are going to use a moral justification to try and bring Germany down. And the argument is essentially of the superior moral cause of the Allies vis-a-vis the Germans. And so continuously, when you look at the language revolving around the attacks on Germany, it is couched in terms of almost sort of the coming of the apocalypse, that this is God's judgment, God's wrath being visited on the cities of Germany for having allowed such a demonic government to come into existence as per their moral arguments. So all of this was used, but of course, practically this means that the war has extended beyond, you can say, a limited conflict involving purely military targets into becoming a total war, or beyond that, what many in Germany considered at that time, it was a war of annihilation. And of course, the consequences of a war of annihilation, it means not only is the civilian population going to be targeted, but Germany's entire infrastructure and culture is also going to be susceptible to this targeted campaign of annihilation. So, Alexander, do you think there's anything I've left out regarding trying to summarize how we got to this point in 1942?
No, that makes complete sense. I would say that perhaps too, on the subject of dehousing, if you're attacking a military center or a center of production or a transport hub, if you can dehouse the workers who are doing the work, then you are necessarily disrupting the work, as well as sort of bombing the railways, the roads, the bridges, and the factories. If you're disrupting the actual workforce, you would necessarily be having an impact on the war effort. I mean, obviously that's sort of tangential. You'd be dehousing a lot of people who are not related to the war effort at all.
But I mean, beyond that, who are these foreign laborers? They are mainly slave laborers being brought in from the Eastern campaigns. So not only are the Allies targeting non-combatants, but they are also attacking people who are potentially citizens of the Soviet Union, who are now their major land ally in this conflict. So major sort of not just moral implications, but diplomatic repercussions that can fall as a result of this this bombing campaign. But of course, it's not as if it would really bother Stalin that much,
no.
Given that
noted humanist. Yes.
No,
I can't think of anything to add to that. No, that's very good.
I think, I mean, regarding the point about Stalin, another point I want to bring up is that despite the Zeppelin campaigns during the First World War, it wasn't significant enough to actually motivate any change in what was essentially the Geneva Conventions as then existed. The Hague and Geneva Conventions were compiled between, as far as I believe, 1895 and 1907, before the First World War. And they mainly pertained to land warfare, of course, because by 1907, the plane had only been recently invented, and aviation was a novelty in terms of expanding the scope of warfare in 1907. But it's interesting that between 1907 and 1939, the discourse revolving around the moral use of aerial combat didn't really change. If anything, therefore, this could leave some credence for the Germans in utilizing aerial warfare in the way that they did, because there was nothing in the standards of international law that directly prohibited them from doing so. And of course, by that same logic, nothing prohibiting the Allies from using those that same logic. The only
Oh, sorry, and this was actually a key thought behind the development of the airship in Britain, which of course obviously the Germans have been pioneers of this, but the development of airships in Britain, France, and to a much lesser degree America was based on this idea that these would be the ideal bombing platforms. As it turned out, they couldn't get the technology right. They had problems with using hydrogen and so forth, and there were a number of famous disasters which cut the program short. But their intention was to use basically to develop their own wet zeppelins to use against Germany should there be a second war.
I'm just trying to think of, oh yes, there was a movement in the America in 1920s and 30s to try and protect cultural monuments specifically, not non-combatants, but this idea of the preservation of culture, what ultimately I think would evolve into the various United Nations conventions, UNESCO, etc., which are dedicated to the preservation of certain culturally significant monuments. However, before 1940, in terms of being able to use this as a justification to prevent aerial bombardment, it was never ratified internationally. And so this sort of growing movement towards conservation and warfare didn't ultimately affect World War II at all, as evidenced by the destruction. And indeed, if there was a significant revision of the codes of aerial conduct after the war, that would essentially by proxy demonize all the Allied efforts made during the war. So this has left aerial warfare in a very awkward situation regarding the ethics pertaining to it. In terms of the actual sort of beginning of the bombing campaigns, incendiary bombs essentially revolutionized the whole nature of warfare in the sense that you could set an entire city alight. The temperatures would be so severe that you whip up a firestorm, which creates such an intensive heat and area destruction that entire cities could basically be wiped off the face of the earth. And of course, for Germany, Germany, of course, had many concentrated industrialized areas, such as in the Ruhr, which was very severely hit by bombing. But of course, Germany also had many huge infrastructure of medieval cities. And of course, medieval cities were the perfect targets for incendiary bombing. And therefore, as a result of this, it is the ancient German civilization that emanating from the medieval era that is essentially the prime target for this campaign of bombing. The first major bombing was targeted at Lübeck, which historically was a major Hanseatic city, a major port on the Baltic. This was then extended to Operation Millennium, which was a 1,000 bomber campaign directed against the city of Cologne. I went off and I found some photochromes of the cities as they would have existed a few decades before. So that is the city of Cologne on the Rhine, and you can see Cologne Cathedral in the background. And after Operation Millennium, 1942, we see the destruction towards the end of the war, which I think I don't really need to say anything regarding the contrast between these two images. I mean, they're not parallel images exactly, but I think it gives an indication of the scale of destruction, given that this was the first time such overwhelming lethal force had been utilized against a major built-up area. I mean, for contrast, take Dresden, for example, towards the end of the war. In Dresden, over a series of few days, 25,000 people at a minimum were killed. Estimates have sometimes been wildly exaggerated to as many as 300,000, but those numbers have been continually revised down. And when it comes to numbers of deaths, unless you have very sort of specific records, I tend not to get too fussed about precise numbers of deaths because again, all of these claims can vary wildly, so I don't tend to focus on any one particular number. But under any circumstances, 25,000 to 300,000, it's a huge number of people civilians being killed in a very short amount of time. In Coventry, for example, 1,000 people were killed during the entire Blitz campaign, which was an 8-month campaign against the city of London. Between 30 and 40,000 people were killed. To put that in perspective, that was the number of dead during the Operation Gomorrah against the city of Hamburg, which again took place over only a few days. So the scale of destruction which is being brought on Germany by the RAF Bomber Command is in a different league compared to the destruction that had been brought on Britain by the Luftwaffe until this time.
Yes, I think Nuremberg was also targeted, one of the medieval cities, because, of course, the characteristic of medieval cities is that they're built largely from wood and plaster. You've got narrow streets. You don't have access to mains water in some cases. You don't have the streets that are wide enough to get fire engines down, even if you had fire engines. And yes, so this means that once you start a firestorm in a city, well, even we've seen this, the fire in the city of London in, was it 1666? Nothing to do with bombing. You just set off a fire like that in an environment in that with those circumstances, and it burns very readily, and it's very difficult to stop. I think the loss of Nuremberg was particularly grievous because it was a center of culture much before it was a center of where the Nazis held their rallies and promulgated their laws, which became a subject of particular ire for the Allies. That Nuremberg was quite famous as a center of the arts, center of manufacturing. It was very closely associated with metalworking, with engraving, with goldsmithing, and of course it was the home of Albrecht Dürer. And so yes, and that was one of the reasons why the Nazis chose that as their site for Nazi propaganda displays and legislative, tentpole legislature, as it were, because it had a long distinguished history as not only just a German city, but specifically as a Bavarian center of culture.
And you bring up two very interesting points. One is on the nature of incendiary bombing and how that affected London. Of course, the Nazis effectively were exponents in incendiary warfare. And as with the Zeppelin campaigns, this then has a major effect on Allied war planning. But regarding the desire to go after symbolic targets, such as Nuremberg, this plays into the whole idea that these attacks were ideologically motivated, but also that there was an aspect of retribution brought into this whole era of conflict. There's a quote from Bomber Harris, I think, where the Germans started this war believing they were going to bomb everyone else, and I will prove how horrifically mistaken they are. And regarding Arthur Harris, I just have a short segment regarding the logic of the bombing campaign, which I want to read. It's only a couple of pages, and then I want to talk about Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
A conclusive factor in deciding to continue the offensive was probably the propaganda value. Essential for bolstering British morale, the daily reports of the systematic destruction in British newspapers at a time when all other contact with the enemy on the continent of Europe had been cut off, with the exception of the Soviet Union, of course. For these reasons, there can hardly have been any question of sacking Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, who still inflexibly supported his strategy, even when it was obvious that it was not working, and this is after several years. Some commentators also claimed, and not working in the sense that there was no major uprising against Germans throughout this entire period. Indeed, National Socialism would have to be comprehensively defeated, and Germany would have to be occupied in order for the regime to collapse. Hitler would have to commit suicide. Goebbels would have to commit suicide, until the government had basically been whittled down to a few moderate Nazis and Karl Dönitz, again representing the military angle of all this. So the idea of a morale warfare and using this as some sort of not just incendiary in terms of the literal fire bombs, but starting a fire of resistance against the National Socialists failed categorically during this time. Some commenters also claim that Bomber Harris had managed to secure a peculiar hold over the otherwise domineering and intrusive Winston Churchill. For although on various occasions the Prime Minister expressed certain scruples about the horrifying bombardment of defenseless cities, he consoled himself, obviously under the influence of Harris and his dismissal of any arguments against his policy, with the idea that there was now, as he put it, a higher poetic justice at work, and that those who had loosed these horrors upon mankind will now in their homes and persons feel the shattering strokes of just retribution. In fact, there is much to suggest that in Harris, a man who had risen to the head of Bomber Command, who, according to Solly Zuckerman, liked destruction for its own sake, and was thus in perfect sympathy with the innermost principle of every war, which is to aim for a wholesale annihilation of an enemy within his dwellings, his history, and his natural environment, as can be possibly achieved. Elias Canetti has linked the fascination of power in its purest form to the growing number of its accumulated victims. In line with this idea, Sir Arthur Harris's position was unassailable because of his unlimited interest in destruction. His plan for successive devastating strikes, which he followed uncompromisingly to the end, was overwhelmingly simple in its logic, and by comparison, any real strategic alternatives, such as disabling the fuel supply, were bound to look like mere diversionary tactics. The war in the air was pure and undisguised. Its continuation in the face of all reason suggests that, as Elaine Scarry has put it in her extremely perspicacious book, The Body in Pain, the victims of war are not sacrifices made as the means to an end of any kind, but in the most precise sense are both the means and the end in themselves. And indeed, if you're looking at the justification, say, for example, of the Dresden bombings, the total destruction of civilian infrastructure, targeting refugees and causing mass chaos on the ground, i.e., the destruction of civilians, was a necessity of this conflict. And indeed, I do believe there is a fundamental horrific logic to what has been stated here, that if Britain had the capabilities for bringing more destruction upon Germany, and they decided only to focus on combatants and military targets, there would have been questions as to why we're not doing everything in our power to bring about Germany's defeat.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was also the thinking behind the development of the nuclear bomb, which was initially planned to be used in Germany, and could not have been used in any other way other than the way it was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That would have been over a major population center. So yes, this was entirely what was due to Germany if the Manhattan program had completed its work a few months earlier.
Well, this is actually an interesting point. I mean, obviously the Oppenheimer film came out recently, and in many senses, I mean, I actually, I was pleasantly surprised because it wasn't completely awful, which that's usually my opinion when I come in and watch historical films. I usually come in to be disappointed, but there were some of the things I found interesting in it. But a lot of things which I find rather sad about watching historical films is that with Oppenheimer, I have no particular interest in his life at all. And yet when watching Oppenheimer, I felt, well, the film probably knows about as much as I do, which isn't saying much. But anyway, an interesting angle which wasn't put across in this film was a dark thought which I've considered regarding Oppenheimer. Maybe I'll look into this more deeply. But when looking into the Morgenthau Plan, which was the plan put forward by the then US Treasury Secretary to deliberately deindustrialize Germany, create an agricultural zone in the center of Europe, essentially an intentional no man's land between the Soviet empires and the NATO allies. And on top of that, and on top of the intentional deindustrialization program, Germany would be forever separated, which wasn't actually a policy of the Allies until after the war, from 1945 until 1948. And as John Not Real Name is saying in the chat, the Starve All Germans plan would have involved the starvation of around 20 million. Again, in addition to the destruction of cities, the intensification of the destruction of populations as well. But part of Morgenthau's hatred towards Germany, of course, given his Jewish heritage, was built into this idea of retribution, which we've read about with Arthur Harris, and indeed this idea of a complete moral condemnation, wiping the slate clean regarding this regime which has unleashed so many horrors onto the world that it basically deserves to be wiped off the face of the earth. And something that occurred to me when watching the Oppenheimer film recently was whether Oppenheimer regretted not his involvement in creating the bomb, but whether he couldn't drop it on Germany, whether it was the wrong target, whether he would have felt so morally repulsed had he been able to drop the bomb on his original target.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think that that plan for Germany was not a million miles away from the Nazi plan for Eastern Europe and especially for Russia. It was very similar. It was the idea about clearing. I mean, in that sense, it was clearing land because it was going to be settled by their own people. That wasn't the plan for Germany, but in other respects, it's quite similar.
Well, regarding Lebensraum in particular, I mean, I'd just be a quick point because it's tangential. The first argument was, of course, the destruction of Bolshevism, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and then by extension, it would have meant the disintegration of Russia as an entity, devolving Russia into various constituent parts, reviving the idea of Muscovy as opposed to a Russian empire. Funny enough, what a lot of people are wanting to happen with the Ukraine conflict at the moment.
Oh yes, I saw that. Yeah.
And to my mind, at least in the short term, German plans would have basically revolved around almost creating a situation as what had happened in the Baltic for hundreds of years, creating a German aristocracy to rule over other populations. But regarding specific instances of destruction via cities and civilian populations, Hitler's plan revolved around the creation of wonder weapons and the development of the V1 and the V2 rockets. There's an interesting argument regarding the development of German rocket capabilities as to whether Germany should have used it for destructive capabilities, i.e. attacking London, because in the end, despite the fact that V1 and V2 would later form the basis for ICBMs and new delivery mechanisms for nuclear warheads, they had a minimal effect in terms of the overall outcome of the war. A possible better usage of such wonder weapons would have been for aerial defense, given the destruction being brought on German cities at this time, despite the fact that Albert Speer, the head of German armaments from 1942 onwards, was able to keep German war production up, again helped with foreign workers as a euphemism to continue, even after, say, for example, the Dam Busters operation, to keep the German war machine chugging out more tanks and artillery, etc., etc. Just bringing up the point on another point which that film made, which is why I was thinking about it recently, and I went ahead and did some research on this regarding the justification being used that we must create the bomb because the Germans can't have the bomb. Well, the German bomb was never going to be created unless from 1939 Hitler had given all the resources to a single visionary leader like a Heisenberg equivalent, as Oppenheimer had been given with Los Alamos. Because as it so happened, the German bombing campaign for the nuclear bomb was decentralized. It was part of the competing power mechanisms within the German Empire, whereby essentially, if you look at Goebbels with his Volkssturm, if you look at Heinrich Himmler with the SS, if you look at Goering with the Hermann Goering divisions, Germany had basically created the system of feudalism. And Goering and Himmler and Goebbels, etc., were essentially feudal lords paying homage to Hitler as their king, their ultimate liege. And this meant, as with the campaign to create the atomic bomb, that you had all of these competing departments vying over resources, and collectively, all the resources of all the atomic bomb operations only amounted to 1,000th of the resources that were given to the Manhattan Project. In other words, the Germans were never going to create a bomb, and the whole justification, we can see at the time there would have been a justification for building it faster than Germans. But the likelihood is the bomb would have never been created unless Hitler had decided something in 1939. And even with the speed that we see with the creation of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project, it would have still taken until 1943 before they could have utilized said bomb anyway, from 1939. So this is all academic, but needless to say, if Hitler had the intentions, the Allies had the actual capabilities, as was proven with Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, and ultimately with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one last sort of conversation that I really want to bring about this is maybe doing a Japanese equivalent for this, but as with all of these things, it actually takes quite a lot out
because
of
the
you
firebombing of Tokyo was I think wasn't the death toll was higher than that of either Nagasaki or Hiroshima, I think. I'm not sure about that, but it was extremely high, and it was just as destructive. Yeah.
Well, the total casualties of Japan vis-a-vis Germany were very, very similar. We're talking in excess of 500,000 civilian deaths over a concerted campaign of several years. But of course, with Japan, you can say the bombing campaign was far more intense because it happened over such a shorter window of time, because it took getting to Iwo Jima, winning the island warfare to get within close proximity. I mean, the British were launching aerial bombing raids against Germany at the same time that Operation Midway was underway. So a time frame is something else to consider. But we brought up Operation Millennium, the attack on Lubeck, and now I want to bring up Operation Gomorrah, because more so than Dresden, we think of Dresden. I think mainly because it was so close to the end of the war, March of 1945. Yalta had been held a month before. And in a few months' time, Hitler would have committed suicide and Germany would have surrendered. So Dresden seems, in hindsight, to all of us, to be completely pointless. But as for Hamburg, Hamburg took place in 1943. Hamburg, a lot of people trying to, like A.C. Grayling, who look into the moral justification for the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, like to look at Hamburg as basically killing off the opposition to National Socialism, because Hamburg had always been a hotbed of socialism. So it seemed in that sense rather counterproductive, while they're also targeting Nuremberg, to target cities such as Hamburg. So with such... Hamburg, in contrast to all of these other cities, Operation Gomorrah was the most devastating bombing raid during the entire conflict within Europe. And I'm just going to read the segment again from Sebald to really go into the horrors that were inflicted there. It was not always easy to get a more detailed picture of the manner and extent of the destruction. The need to know was at odds with a desire to close down the senses. On the other hand, large quantities of disinformation were circulating. On the other, there were true stories that exceeded anyone's capacity to grasp them. There were said to be 200,000 dead in Hamburg. Reck writes that he cannot believe all he hears, for he has been told a good deal about the severely confused state of mind of those refugees from Hamburg, their amnesia, the way they wander around clad only in pajamas, just as they were when they fled from their collapsing homes. Nossack gives a similar account. In the first few days, you could get no definite information. The details of the stories were never accurate. Obviously, in the shock of what these people had experienced, their ability to remember was partly suspended, or else, in compensation, it worked to an arbitrary pattern. Those who had escaped the catastrophe were unreliable and partly blinded witnesses. Alexander Kluger's account of the air raid on Halberstadt on the 8th of April 1945, which was not in fact written until about 1970, but which finally raises the question of the effects of the so-called moral bombing, quotes an American military psychologist who gleaned the impression after the war from conversations with survivors in Halberstadt that the population, although having obviously shown an innate wish to tell its own story, had lost the psychic power of accurate memory, particularly within the confines of the ruined city. Even if this opinion, allegedly that of a real person, is one of Kluger's famous pseudo-documentary devices, it is certainly accurate in identifying the syndrome, for the accounts of which of those who escaped with nothing but their lives do generally have something discontinuous about them, a curiously erratic quality, one so much at variance with authentic recollection that it is easily suggests rumor-mongering and invention. However, the rather unreal effect of the eyewitness reports also derives from the cliches to which they often resorted. The reality of total destruction, the incomprehensible in its extremity, pales when described in such stereotypical phrases as a prey to the flames. That fateful night, all hell was let loose. We were staring into the inferno, the dreadful fate of the cities of Germany, and so on and so forth. Their function is to cover up and neutralize experiences beyond our ability to comprehend. The phrase, on that dreadful day when our beautiful city was razed to the ground, which Kluger's American investigators encouraged in Frankfurt, Furt, Wuppertal, Würzburg, and Halberstadt alike, is really no more than a gesture sketched to banish memory. Even Victor Klemperer's diary entry on the fall of Dresden remains within the bounds of verbal convention. From what we now know about the ruin of the city, it seems unlikely that anyone who then stood on the Brühl terrace with the air full of flying sparks and saw, just get the image up. So this is Hamburg, photochrome from 1936, color photochrome from 1936. This is a rather famous picture of the Lancaster flying on the night of Operation Gomorrah, one of the nights of Operation Gomorrah. And again, probably the most obvious example of dehousing here and of the scale of destruction in Hamburg. But of course, even the destruction of buildings pales in terms of the overall destruction of life. From what we now know about the ruin of the city, it seems unlikely that anyone who stood on the Brühl terrace with the air full of flying sparks and saw the conflagration all around can have escaped with an undisturbed mind. The apparently unimpaired ability shown in most of the eyewitness reports of everyday language to go on functioning as usual raises doubts of the authenticity of their experiences that they record. The death by fire within a few hours of an entire city, with all its buildings and its trees, its inhabitants, its domestic pets, its fixtures and fittings of every kind, must inevitably have led to overload, to paralysis of the capacity to think and feel in those who succeed in escaping. The accounts of individual eyewitnesses, therefore, are of only qualified value and need to be supplemented by what a synoptic and artificial view reveals. In the summer of 1943, during a long heat wave, the RAF, supported by the US 8th Army Force, flew a series of raids on Hamburg. The aim of Operation Gomorrah, as it was called, was to destroy the city and reduce it as completely as possible to ashes. In a raid early in the morning of the 27th of July, beginning at 1 a.m., 10,000 tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs were dropped on the densely populated residential area east of the Elbe, comprising the districts of Hammerbrook, Ham Nord, and Ham Sud, Bilverde, Ausschlag, and parts of St. George Eiblech, Barmbek, and Vansbeck. A now familiar sequence of events occurred. First of all, the doors and windows were torn from their frames and smashed by high explosive bombs weighing 4,000 pounds. Then the attic floors of the buildings were ignited by lightweight incendiary mixtures. And at the same time, firebombs weighing up to 15 kilograms fell into the lower stories. Within a few minutes, huge fires were burning all over the target area, which covered some 20 square kilometers. And they merged so rapidly that only a quarter of an hour after the first bombs had dropped, the whole airspace was a sea of flames as far as the eye could see. Another 5 minutes later, at 1:20 a.m., a firestorm of an intensity that no one could ever before have thought possible arose. The fire, now rising 2,000 meters into the sky, snatched oxygen to itself so violently that the air currents reached hurricane force, resonating like mighty organs with all their stops pulled out at once. The fire burned like this for 3 hours. At its height, the storm lifted gables and roofs from buildings, flung rafters and entire advertising hoardings through the air, tore trees from the ground, and drove human beings before it like living torches. Behind collapsing facades, the flames shot up as high as houses, rolled like a tidal wave through the streets at a speed of over 150 kilometers an hour, spun across open squares in strange rhythms like rolling cylinders of fire. The water in some of the canals was ablaze. The glass in tramcar windows melted. Stocks of sugar boiled in the bakery cellars. Those who had fled from their air raid shelters with grotesque contortions in the thick bubbles thrown up by the melting asphalt. No one knows for certain how many lost their lives that night, or how many went mad before they died. When day broke, the summer dawn could not penetrate the leaden gloom above the city. The smoke had risen to a height of 8,000 meters, where it spread like a vast anvil-shaped cumulus cloud. A wavering heat, which the bomber pilots said they had felt through the sides of their planes, continued to rise from the smoking, glowing mounds of the stone. Residential districts with a street length of 200 kilometers in all were utterly destroyed. Horribly disfigured corpses lay everywhere. Bluish little phosphorus flames still flickered around many of them. Others had been roasted brown or purple and reduced to a third of their normal size. They lay doubled up in pools of their own melted fat, which is sometimes already congealed. In the next few days, the central death zone was declared a no-go area. When punishment labor gangs and camp inmates could begin clearing it in August after the rubble had cooled down, they found people still sitting at tables or up against the wall where they had been overcome by monoxide gas. Elsewhere, clumps of flesh and bone or whole heaps of bodies had cooked in the water gushing from bursting boilers. Other victims had been so badly charred and reduced by ashes by the heat, which had risen to 1,000 degrees or more, that the remains of families consisting of several people could be carried away in a single laundry basket. The exodus of survivors from Hamburg had begun on the night of the air raid itself. It started, as Nosek writes, with constant movement in all the neighboring streets, where everyone was going, no one knew. The refugees, numbering 1.25 million, dispersed all over the Reich as far as its outer borders. For his diary entry of the 20th of August 1943, Friedrich describes a group of 40 to 50 such refugees trying to force their way into a train at a station in Upper Bavaria. As they do so, a cardboard suitcase falls on the platform, bursts open and spills its contents. Toys, a manicure case, singed underwear. And last of all, the roasted corpse of a child, shrunk like a mummy, with its half-deranged mother, has been carrying about her the relic of a past that was still intact only a few days ago. It is hard to imagine that Reck can have invented this dreadful scene. All over Germany, one way or another, news of the horrors of the destruction of Hamburg must have been spread by distraught refugees, vacillating between a hysterical will to survive and leaden apathy. Reck's diary at least makes it clear that in spite of the news blackout suppressing all detailed information, it was not impossible to know how horribly the cities of Germany were being destroyed. In terms of the sort of strategic significance of this also coincides with the collapse of Mussolini's regime in Italy and the victory of the Soviets over the Germans, the Battle of Kursk. So really it's the culmination of all of these events which to me signals the fact that Germany is definitively going to lose this war, albeit there are other sort of, despite all the horrific aspects which I brought up, which was very intentional. I wanted a very vivid account as to the exact horror of everything that occurred in Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah. Despite the fact that all of these eyewitness accounts were pervading throughout Germany, despite the fact that all of these refugees were fleeing to all parts of the Reich, and indeed Upper Bavaria is quite far away from Hamburg in the grand scheme of things, if you look at the geography of Germany.
So it's very distant. It's the other end of Germany.
The fact that this didn't have the intended effect, the moral warfare, the destruction of the enemy's morale. In fact, when Berlin was bombed shortly after this in a series of concerted waves, many Germans actually felt relief and they felt joy that Berlin was being attacked, because there seemed to be some devastating yet great equality in the fact that all of these German cities were being bombed. And so a denizen of Hamburg would look to a city which hadn't been bombed and look at the denizens with a disgust. And it's incredible that rather than creating a sense of hatred towards National Socialism, it actually created a sense of hatred towards the survivors. The entire basis of destroying the enemy morale, despite the disturbing sights, despite everything that this condition created, gave Bomber Harris and the Allies no pause for thought regarding what they were doing. And even within months of the war's end, this type of campaign continued unabated with the use of the firestorm.
Yeah, it's worth also mentioning that Hitler himself actually wasn't too averse to the bombing of Berlin, because he had this plan that Berlin would be supplanted by a greater Berlin, which would be called Germania.
Yeah.
And in his scheme for building, this would have involved the destruction of much of Berlin. The sort of the building of very straight roads, boulevards, and various significant monuments and buildings that would have effaced what was there before. And he said that it's been recorded that he did say to people, well, this bombing campaign that's affecting Berlin, it's good for us because it's demolishing all the stuff that we would have demolished anyway. So there's that to consider.
No, that's a very important point. I mean, even before the war began, because Berlin is actually a terrible place if you're going to build a monumental city of stone, because
yes,
the whole
the geology is
area,
awful.
the geology is awful. I mean, the only reason why Berlin happened to be the capital of a German empire was because of the miraculous tenacity of the Prussians, not because the area had any sort of economic vitality, especially that Brandenburg area, which, I mean, it's called the Mark. It was always the distant sort of furthest reaches of Germany, whereas the real sort of center of power was, say, for example, the Worms, the region around Frankfurt, west, areas like Bavaria, even Saxony, in contrast, is a far sort of a richer territory than that of Brandenburg proper. But nevertheless,
yeah, but Brandenburg is. I used to live in Germany, and you'd get out, and as soon as you get out of the metropolis of Berlin, you'd get into Brandenburg, and it was rather desolate. Yeah.
And for some reason, Hitler still wanted Berlin to be the city, to be the capital city in Germania, and they were testing the ground to see if it could withstand the construction of this monumental city of stone, which was to have a Arc de Triomphe, which actually sat above the Brandenburg Gate and dwarfed it. There was going to be a People's Dome in the center, which was going to be a new. Which was a People's Hall, which was going to be a new sort of more than a civic monument. It was going to be a religious monument to German nationalism and German victory. But all of these building schemes, I mean, obviously Hitler started off as an artist. In terms of his mentality, he was always interested in architecture, and conjoined, of course, with Albert Speer, who devised many of these plans for him. The irony, of course, about all of these grand ideas for flattening Germany so a new greater Germany could be built on the ashes is that Vienna, comparatively, was actually very lightly bombed, especially when you compare it to, say, for example, Dresden or Nuremberg. And of all the cities that Hitler would have actually appreciated the Allies completely demolish, it would have been Vienna.
Do you know? Yeah, considering his antipathy towards the Viennese. Do you know why Vienna was treated lightly? Was this because the Allies considered it not truly part of Germany, that it might have, because of the Anschluss, it wasn't necessarily a willing partner in the Reich's effort?
Well, this is an interesting question, which I've sort of gone back and forth about, because on the one hand, Austria was very clearly part of the Reich because it was occupied in a four-power sharing agreement like Germany was. It wasn't instantly sort of created as its own government, but it was ultimately reunified in 1955. And after 1955, you have people like Karl Renner coming back, the Austrian socialist chancellor, And there is very much this post hoc attempt to try and create a Austrian nationalism, which is entirely predicated around a repudiation of the Anschluss. As for the actual feelings in 1938 to 1945, even though the plebiscite was inflated, I mean, that's sort of beyond doubt. I do not doubt that the majority of Austrians wanted reunification with Germany. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there were clamoring calls for Austria to be united with Germany, with the new Weimar Republic, which of course were thwarted by the Allies. So the creation, you can say the creation of Austrian nationalism vis-a-vis Germany, to my mind, was very much post hoc, and it was successful. It was very successful, and even to this day, Austrian neutrality, in contrast to Germany's complete West integration and alignment with NATO, Austria is still not a member of NATO, despite being a member of the European Union. All of these things pervade from that mindset regarding Austria's particular status during the war. But I think it was because Vienna was considered extra German. And when you look at all plans revolving around partition, they all focused on the borders of 1937. Austria was never considered de jure part of the Reich in any of the peace plans. It was always assumed that Austria was going to be detached from Germany in the event of a peace, as with the Sudetenland, as with West Prussia, as with Alsace and Lorraine. These regions were considered occupied regions to some extent, albeit Austria has this very odd status as having willingly partaken of unification with Germany, as with the Sudeten Germans, and indeed a vast number of Germans throughout all of Europe who wanted to be rejoined to the Reich, or rejoined for the first time with an expanded German Reich, which was to encompass all the German populations. So to my mind, that accounts, and again, the fact that Vienna was a major cultural center, but also the fact that Vienna was an afterthought, really, in terms of the main thrust of Soviet advance. The Soviets were focused primarily on Berlin. So, for example, cities like Prague were still under German occupation even after the fall of Berlin. The Soviets, of course, had rushed through the Balkans after Romania had switched sides and they had taken over Hungary. But Vienna remained, as far as I'm aware, within the geographic boundaries of the Reich towards the end of the war, as indeed did large parts of northern Italy. And for that reason, Vienna was actually very far removed from the actual conflict zone. But of course, relaying this back to dehousing and destruction, Hitler's plan, as with building Germania in Berlin, was basically not to destroy Vienna, but rather to eclipse it and take the city of Linz, which of course he spent most of his childhood there, and create Linz as the new grand German city on the Danube to completely eclipse Vienna.
Yeah, so I must apologize about that doorbell. That was someone trying to deliver a takeaway that wasn't ordered. It wasn't for us, but I manfully resisted accepting it. Yeah, I do remember that the idea was that they were going to come up north through Italy, and the so-called soft belly of Italy, as it was called, turned out to be a hard spine, and they didn't get close to Vienna. Yes, that it was a pincer attack by the Western Allies and by the Russians heading towards Berlin. It was essentially a race to Berlin, and that would decide matters. So that makes sense. Interestingly enough, the Germans did build one of those massive Flakturm in Vienna, and it's still there. There were 3, I believe, in Berlin, all of which have now been destroyed. One of which was only partly destroyed, but the Viennese one, interestingly enough, is standing proud and has never been taken down. I'd be very interested to find out if one could get inside. I think it's probably been converted into sort of like a cultural space or something. But yeah, but it's evidence of the fact that they didn't treat the Viennese as a sort of as true participants in the Reich, because they didn't destroy the flak turm in the way that they did destroy the flak turm in Berlin.
Yes, I think. I mean, I've last time I visited Vienna, I also saw the flak towers, and again, it is quite a remarkable monument. But that's not to say Vienna wasn't bombed. Vienna was bombed various times. Roughly 20% of the city was destroyed, but nothing compared to the scale of what I just described.
Well, the Allies bombed Rotterdam, so they weren't averse to bombing non-German targets.
Yes, and of course, this is another implication of or side effect of the Allied sort of moral bombing, is that they were prepared to even bomb occupied territories. And of course, the civilian populations under, say, for example, the Netherlands in particular, also suffered from the incompetencies of the Allies. So, for example, after Operation Market Garden, the attempt to cross over at Arnhem and invade Germany through the Netherlands failed. The Germans retaliated on the Dutch by basically cutting off food supplies, which again is a direct consequence of the failure of Operation Market Garden. But again, that's another conversation, really. What I have now for the remainder of this stream is a segment from Der Brand by Jörg Friedrich, which is actually a very comprehensive book regarding every aspect of it, from the actual nature of the bombing, the strategy, Germany's response, and of course the cultural effects. And I'm reading from a chapter called The Stone. And I mean, it's in terms of the actual strategy, I don't agree with everything, but regarding the cultural effects, I do believe this is a very useful source to read, and that there are going to be a lot of individual instances of destruction regarding not only the buildings, but also, I mean, the literary heritage, the books, say, for example, in archives and libraries and artworks. So if you want to, again, Alexander, if you want to interrupt me at any point, please do so. Okay. I'll try and take longer breaks at the end of paragraphs, so there might be natural points for you to come in. So, all right. On April the 9th, 1943, Hitler ordered that artistically precious ceiling and wall frescoes be photographed in color. They started in the Western administrative districts of Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Aachen, and included sculptures, choir stalls, and furniture as well. Okay, so this is a few months after Operation Millennium in Cologne and a few months before Operation Gomorrah. A few years and a half later, Hitler decreed, in view of the steadily growing losses and irreplaceable artistic and cultural assets through the air war, I consider it urgently desirable that valuable monuments and other unmovable works of art be photographed to the greatest extent possible, that is, in detail. In December of 1944, the photographers also prepared pictures of the small and medium-sized cities in Frankfurt. The daily Frankfurter Zeitung suggested in the spring of 1942, after the attacks on Lübeck and Cologne, that the 19th century patrician townhouses be photographed, because who knows how long this Frankfurt will continue to stand. The old town stood until the March 1944 attacks. On March the 22nd, the anniversary of Goethe's death, the house he was born in at Amsgrossen, Hirschgraben, number 23, went down. People had kept night watches to protect the house. Through holes in the cellar wall, it was linked with the Frankfurt catacomb system and served as an intact exit to the street when people in the neighborhood were trapped by rubble. On March 18th, the mansard roofs caught fire, but it was gotten under control, right above the room in which Goethe was born. 4 days later, nothing could be done. Hirschgraben burned from both ends and was impassable, as were the intersecting streets. The residents lost their orientation in the hurricane and wondered where they were. Between March 22nd and 24th, the building, whose cornerstone was laid by the young Goethe when it was expanded in 1755, slowly burned to the ground. The walls were damp, so it took a long time. Damage was caused by water used to fight the fire, as well as from the fire itself. On the morning of March 23rd, the gable room disappeared. At midday, the stairwell collapsed. The next day, all that remained were the cellar and the cellar stairs, the sandstones posts, the doors and windows, and the window arches. In September, a blockbuster toppled the last remaining walls on the ground floor. It was one of the older townhouses, of which Frankfurt had maintained 2,000. Two remained undamaged, a few others saved parts of their ground floor. The March raids, with 2 million incendiary sticks, razed the ring of medieval buildings around the Römerberg main square and the cathedral, including the Gothic town hall, which the Kaisersaal, the Imperial Hall, the Old Mint, St. Paul's Church, and the Schopenhauer House. The sofa Schopenhauer died on and his desk were removed from the ground floor in time. Explosives struck the southern transport of the cathedral, the southern transept of the cathedral, where from 1356 on, the German emperor had been elected and since 1562 crowned. The stone house, the most beautiful patrician townhouse from the Middle Ages, with corner towers and crenellations, was lost. A replica was later built from the photographs. The stone house was one of the most vulnerable of all targets in the fire war. Residents proved to be more tenacious than anything. Industry reproduced itself, and 80% of the archives of books and works of art that could be saved due to their mobility. However, the hardest, oldest, most permanent material, though it had bridged the ages, lacked any power of resistance. Stone was immobile. That which gave its firmness over centuries, its anchoring the ground, had now fettered it, rendering it unbudgeable. In October 1943, 1 in 5 Frankfurters could be evacuated. Industry found accommodation in monstrous bunkers 100 feet high, 1,600 feet long, and 650 feet wide. The Frankfurt town hall, the Römer, on the other hand, stood in the same place for 5 centuries and was not portable. Because the fire war created a realm of destruction, stone was at a disadvantage. The bomber circulated everywhere, but the bomb was fixed on a certain segment of ground. It could not reach the greatest part of the country, so an alternative area existed. Only stone with its weight confronted the bomb, with its destination on the same exact piece of ground. Destructive force and inertia met eye to eye. From the bombardment perspective, there was not so much to do, if not for the stone house and its inventory. An air offensive could do little damage to a rural population. Its violence unfurled only in collapsing that which was firm and solid, in burying people and property in rubble, in creating fire brigades and draft conditions in the buildings. Stone and weapon merged. The air war was not the tonnage dropped, but the blazing cities thereby created. The dwellings of generations did not merely split in two, they became masses of stone that struck people dead, glowing ovens that asphyxiated, dungeons that gassed to death. Its final face was that of fury. The stone was broken and dispossessed at once. It was the main tool of the enemy, its most pernicious aggregate.
Yes,
When stone and weapon,
it's very sobering. I did, for anyone who's visited Frankfurt am Main recently, or I know post-war, will have seen how it's been completely sort of it's lost most of its character. Unfortunately, some of the older buildings have been repaired. Goethe's house has been rebuilt. I've actually visited that, and it's quite a convincing rebuild. But obviously, it's not exactly how it was, and it's not the actual materials that it was. So you notice the impact of the bombing in Frankfurt more than many places.
When stone and weapon became one through the 68,000 blockbusters and 80 million thermite sticks, it spoiled people's images of the city's landscape that was rooted in history. Later on, people did not want to rebuild the pre-war structures for several reasons. There was only weak support for the idea of restoring the unity of space and history. It would cost too much money and effort. The venue had been discredited by the horrors of the fire, and the newly built cities would have to be more comfortable, have better transportation, and more importantly, be better bomb-proofed. The residents ultimately tore down more stone than the bomb did. They could no longer stand to look at those fateful shells. In the summer of 1942, after the raids on Lübeck and Rostock had just inaugurated the fire war, A conference of cultural and air raid protection officials discussed how they would deal with monuments, museums, and libraries. The danger of a direct hit by a high explosive bomb was minimal, but a complex such as Berlin City Palace with its huge top floor and barely accessible false floors would require an extensive fire watch contingent with knowledge of the building. It was as if a castle were built to burn down, as had been confirmed in the demise of Kassel's residential palace. The water supply and firefighting crews were nowhere near adequate in containing the flames that leapt over from neighboring department stores. Interior walls lined with silk, gilded woodcuts on the doors and sills, parquet floors, and the red sandstone offered a wealth of combustibles. It joined the swarms of incendiary sticks. No one could interfere with that mutual attraction. The Johannesburg Renaissance castle in Aschaffenburg, one of the most beautiful of its kind, was gutted in several raids between November 1944 and April 1945. Castles have roofs that simply could not be saved.
Yeah, it's. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say yes. I mean, that was very true in many places. It also affected Potsdam, which is relatively dispersed as a centre, which I think maybe we'll mention later on.
The Air Ministry recommended covering the attics with 30-inch layers of sand. The small diameter of the 4-pound incendiaries helped it attain a considerable final velocity and penetrating strength. Sand could have stopped them, but the suggested depth weighed 330 pounds per square foot, and ordinary ceilings could not withstand such a weight. 2 layers of hard-burned brick or 8 inches of reinforced concrete slab would also have hindered the impact, but it was impossible to furnish all German buildings with that. After experiments performed by the Bavarian Palace Department, the attic floors were insulated against flying sparks and the impact of isolated hits. In May of 1943, at the threshold of the firestorms, Göring and Himmler started immunizing the old towns with a white lime and saline solution. Thousands of buildings steeped in tradition were limed, including the Wartburg Castle. This disintegrated the treated wooden parts, but by no means made them fireproof. In the fall, a list of buildings to be protected was published, but the guards were helpless in the face of fires. Islands within wide area conflagrations could only be saved with pure luck. The raid on Bonn in October 1944 started at 10:30. The attackers were gone within 30 minutes. Dr. Franz Redermacher hurried from his place of work in the Rhenish State Museum to the monuments in the Old Town. From the train overpass at Poppelsdorfer Alle, he could already see everything ablaze. The southern tract of the university was all on fire, all the way to the Rhine. Nothing could be done about that. Schinkel's Academic Art Museum had so far caught fire only at the corner of the roof. Professors Richard Delbruck and Ernst Langlotz just formed a bucket brigade. Redermacher joined them. While they were extinguishing the fire, the air raid sirens sounded. The helpers fled to the museum basement. The flames continued their work. False alarm. The follow-up raid did not happen. Redermacher left the museum to the professors and ran down the blazing rows of houses on the Rigamotserstrasse to the market square. The wall of fire closed behind him. Up ahead at the old town hall, there was not a single person who was concerned about the already gutted building, which dated from the time of electors, i.e. the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. My next destination was Beethoven's birthplace. I got there about noon. The house was undamaged except for shattered windows. Danger threatened from the building next door, to the north, which was burning from the roof to the floorboards. Hasselbach, the castellan, opened up when he heard the loud shouting. Some soldiers were standing around in the corridors. They had no idea it was a memorial, but for 30 minutes helped carry some pictures into the cellar, then disappeared. The main inventory at the Beethoven house had long since been put in storage elsewhere. Hasselbach and Redermacher decided to defend the building at 3 points. No more sparks could be allowed to hit the rotting roof truss. The window openings had to be cleared of the shutters and curtains watched, and the cellar was unpredictable. The tobacco stores from the Quantius company in the cellar door next door were smouldering. The usual hole had been broken up in the thick wall separating the cellars, so the fire could spread through at any time. Small explosions sounded constantly at the next door. Hasselback closed the hold with an iron plate and kept it wetted down with water from tubs kept nearby. Quantius was burning away on its own, but not far away to the north. A conflagration was roaring. You could see a huge glaring wall radiating with tremendous heat. It moved forward to the Adam Furnishing store, diagonally across the street. There were piles of mattresses in there. And I can continue. But is there anything you'd like to say so far regarding destruction of
No,
farm?
I would also say that that Germany's ability to build and to maintain was extremely compromised at this time, because you've got to remember that they were also putting in a lot of effort into various defense systems. They were building coastal defenses all along the north coast of France, around the Channel Islands and so forth. And they were pouring in all of that effort and men and material, and also the slave labor as well. That was all going towards defense work. So preservation of cultural monuments was something that they couldn't do. Obviously, you can't add that sort of weight to the roof of a structure and expect it to be stable or safe. So a lot of the schemes are obviously not practical, and also they wouldn't have, even if they'd been carried out, I don't think they would have done anything in a sense of the firestorms that happened in Hamburg and Dresden.
And regarding the concerted efforts, say, for example, to build the Atlantic Wall, which ultimately didn't prevent the Operation Overlord and the D-Day invasion. In the case of the Beethoven House, it was saved, and it was saved because of Redemarche. It wasn't saved because there was an overly concerted attempt by the German authorities to save such a building. Indeed, the air raid protection center basically resigned to the fact that Beethoven's house would go up in flames, as was the case with Goethe's house, but that wasn't the case. In Stuttgart, the house, yes.
No. I was just agreeing.
In Stuttgart, the house that Edvard Mörker died in burned down. In Bayreuth, the tomb of Franz Liszt. In Hanover, St. John's Court and the city church, the grave of Leibniz. In Hamburg, the birthplace of Brahms. In Frankfurt on the Oder, the birthplace of von Kleist. In Hanau, the birthplace of the brothers Grimm. In Eisenach, the Louvre house. The regime could not expend the effort necessary to save monuments and building complexes, given the sparse teams available, even for the protection of life and limb. So protection of stone remained limited to memorabilia. Portals, figures, monuments, Roland's columns, and fountains were wrapped up and enclosed in walls. The Bamberg horseman was surrounded at first by a wooden structure filled with sandbags, and later replaced by an octagonal brick tower encased in plaster and covered with a conical block of reinforced concrete. Angled, broken channels were cut for ventilation purposes. The tomb of St. Sebald in Nuremberg received a similar shell. A 46-foot stamped concrete wall protected the west portal of Nuremberg St. Lorenz Church. Relics were thought to have a perpetual guarantee, such as that provided by the steel mattresses in front of the Tiepolo frescoes in Wolfsburg's residential palace. But such coverings could no longer be supplied by as early as mid-1942, so this is even before the fire bombings. The burlaps for sandbags were in short supply, and there was no wood for the formwork for concrete screens. Paper sacks with lean concrete were used instead to pack the portals of the cathedrals in Cologne, Freiburg, Xanten, Munster, and Paderborn, as well as the beautiful fountain in Nuremberg and the equestrian statue of Frederick the Great along the boulevard of Unter den Linden in Berlin. If an explosive entered such a casing, the protective effect became destructive instead. Pieces of stone were hurled like shells into the artworks. The stone remained ambivalent. Church windows that were walled up or warded off flying sparks, but hindered the air circulation that the frescoes needed to keep mold from destroying them. Church paintings faded away gruesomely, without any packing materials. It was also hard to help the sculpture and relief ornamentation. Improved explosives made it necessary to have secure encasements, shaped like the objects to be protected, with reinforced concrete. There was nothing of the sort available. At their last meeting in Eger, the Luftwaffe and police representatives could not offer the curators of the monuments any blast-proof, fragment-proof walls. By the summer of 1944, the immovable cultural assets were virtually undefended in the face of the finale of fire. They had been abandoned. The photographs were their death masks. At least we know roughly what Ulm once looked like. Hirschstrasse, yeah.
Oh, yes, just to say that it's very common for statues to be protected from frost with these sort of timber structures, timber cladding, as it were. But that's completely inadequate, and yes, so you would need concrete cladding, as it were, and so most of the prestige building projects in Germania, as it were, the new capital of Germany, as it would have been, had halted as well. So they had no materials for those. They'd stopped building even essential infrastructure out in. I know that they stopped in Norway, in occupied Norway as well. So there just wasn't the materials to do any of this. So it's just, yeah.
Hirschstrasse, with its steep, gabled, narrow patrician houses leading to cathedral, was completely destroyed in December 1944, as were the seats of the guilds from the 16th century granary and the arsenal. In the fire raid of December 17th, which blotted out 2/3 of the city centre, the Seal House, founded around 1400, could not be protected. Early evidence of Christian devotion was founded by nuns as an asylum for people with infectious diseases. The City Hall and the Oath House were both destroyed. Despite the 50 individual fires on its roof, and this is Ulm, by the way, the cathedral could be saved by its own firefighting squad thanks to the iron roof truss that was added in 1880. It now stood out tall like a bare trunk, having been robbed of its foliage as entrances on the Walfischgasse and the Hirschstrasse. Potsdam's historic constructions, the works of Schluter, Schinkel, were reduced by 47% in the evening hours of April the 14th, 1945. And to perspective, this was just 2 weeks before Hitler committed suicide. To that end, Bomber Command needed 500 airplanes and 1,700 tons of bombs. It was its last major air raid with an impressive target and an aftermath of 5,000 dead, more than the total dead in the years of 1940 and 1941 throughout all of the Reich. The court and garrison church where Frederick the Great was buried burned, as did Potsdam City Castle, a specimen of Prussian Baroque. The garrison church, of course, was majorly affiliated with the Hohenzollern dynasty, but more than that, Potsdam was associated with the day of Potsdam with the coming of the Third Reich, as Nuremberg, of course, was integral to the rallies. As Friedrich goes on to explain, I'll just mention this bit before we talk more about this. The bomber hammer struck down on the strict stateliness of the entire streets and building ensembles because the stone had a soul. The building structure was an educator that silently taught beauty in form, measure, and aim. The bomb was also an educator, and it judged power and powerlessness. Someone without a defense who cannot appeal the verdict is powerless. If he is defeated, then he is subjugated. The subjugator cannot be made accountable in the name of a religious, legal, or moral obligation, because he is the religion, law, morality, and the justice and the executioner. He shares his authority with no statues. He is the ruler of the ruled. Potsdam was destroyed in order to annul the history of Prussian militarism. England was often and willingly allied with Prussian militarism, but that is not the point here. And what he's referring to here is the fact that during the 7 Years' War, which Hitler would often look to as and of course the entire National Socialist echelons would look to as an inspiration and an allegory for what was going on in Germany, especially from 1942, Frederick the Great's great trial against the three-power attack of France, Austria, and Russia. Of course, England was Prussia's only ally at that point, and of course, lest we forget, it was Marshal Blucher and Wellington that defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. It was the Prussians and the British and the Allied forces with the Dutch and the Belgians, etc. So that is what is referenced when we willingly allied with Prussian militarism. Indeed, the obsessive focus on the defeat of Prussian militarism only really exists in the 20th century. There isn't any sort of precedent for it before then. It waged war against the demon. The demon was an extremely difficult target. A monster and his tools of power had bodily contours, whereas a demon was a spirit, a jinn hidden in some vessel. Whoever destroyed the vessel did not necessarily hit the jinn. It was flexible and moved on. Each and every vessel that could offer a demon a future abode had to be broken in an attempt to track him down. With Potsdam's ruin on April the 14th, the bombers were now hot on the demon's trail. The mythical stone of Potsdam and Nuremberg were triumphantly toppled. Its levelling spoke to the attacker. The enemy had been edified by it, but would be no longer. So would you like to comment specifically on Potsdam and Nuremberg?
Yes. So Potsdam is a small, well, it's hardly even a city, but it was sort of, it's a town which was the capital of Prussia. And that's where the kings resided. This was the center of the military machine. This was the military center of Prussia. It's sort of adjacent to Berlin, which I think is about sort of 30 kilometers away or something. It's a short train ride.
I think, I mean, rather than, I think the capital of the Prussian kings is a good way to describe it. You can almost think of it as the, especially with monuments such as Sanssouci, it is almost like the Prussian equivalent of Versailles.
Yes, so Sanssouci was explicitly modelled on Versailles, and it was essentially an attempt for the Prussians to claim that they had as much cultural learning and savoir-faire, as it were, as the French, which is not entirely convincing, but they did have lots of serious culture there. They did invite, I believe it's Voltaire. They were serious consumers of culture, and so obviously, anyway, but that's beside the point. So so it became a target, although of course it's not really associated with the Nazis at all. The Nazis had a very prickly relationship with the Junkers and the military caste of Prussia. They explicitly developed their own military and their own the SS and the SA were not based at all on Prussian forms. They actually concertedly demolished many of the aspects of Prussian militarism later on, because they found it was an impediment to their war effort or their social ideals. So the idea that the Nazis took Potsdam as one of their cultural or military or nationalistic symbols was not true. They had a very ambivalent relationship with the Prussians, Prussian history.
And this is something rather important to, in terms of the convoluted nature of the attacks on German history up until this point, because of course Germany had only been unified as the Kaiserreich in 1870, and it was unified by Prussia and by the Prussian army. But of course, with Weimar, the German aristocracy still exerted an influence, but the Kaiser himself had fled to the Netherlands. And when the National Revolution occurred in 1933, there was a major democratizing impulse. In fact, there were many ideological charges laid against the old German aristocracy, which was responsible, as claimed by the National Socialists, for the failure of the German war effort in World War I. And in many ways, you can say that the arrival of the new elite, the new National Socialist elite, was meant to eclipse and surpass the old German aristocracy. Some members of the German echelons were more articulate in this, such as Heinrich Himmler, who believed that the Schutzstaffel, the SS, was going to be a new knightly order for the new Germany. And there were others, such as Ernst Röhm, who believed that this was going to be a more democratic force. And of course, he was eliminated during the Night of Long Knives. So this was a position that may have been sort of resolved ideologically had the Germans won the war. But during the course of the war, especially after the 20th of July plot in 1944, many of the Prussian colonels, not so much the generals or the field marshals like von Manstein, but definitely the colonels, were wiped out. And so the idea of National Socialism and the Hohenzollerns, Prussian militarism, all this, and indeed you could say Christian nationalism associated with many of the more conservative elements of the old Germany, were in direct conflict with National Socialism. And so Hitler looked on someone like Schönerer in the Courland pocket as the ideal form of a new German soldier. Indeed, Rommel was used as another example of the archetype of the new German soldier, which made it even more complicated because Rommel, of course, was part of the plot as well and had to commit suicide shortly after the failure of said plot. So all of this is to say that the Allies were very sort of comprehensive, that this wasn't just the demon reflecting the current regime in Germany. This was a demon reflecting all of German history up until this point, you can say, which was articulated by Fritz Fischer in his Sonderweg thesis, the idea of the corrupted path that Germany took to modernity, which dates back to this idea of a arrested development from the Junkers, this military aristocracy and their antiquated ways, which went against this idea of democracy, equality, etc., of the aspects of the French Revolution. And so all of these things must be destroyed. And as with Prussia, it wasn't just the monuments, Potsdam in particular, that was set for destruction, but Prussia itself, of course, was destroyed in 1947. So all of these sort of things need to be taken into account in terms of how thorough this was an attack on German history, more so, and especially in the last couple of weeks of the war, than something that was done genuinely to further the war effort, because there was no chance that the bombing of Potsdam would have had any effect on the war. It wouldn't even shorten the war by a day. But such was the ideological commitment to the War of Annihilation.
Yes, I think there's this the absolute equation of Prussian militarism and Nazism is false. I mean, they're not entirely disconnected, but it is ultimately false. And I think that this was just like a sort of a deliberate strategy of spite. I think that they knew that there was no aspect of Potsdam that had any relevance to the outcome of the war at that late stage.
Well, it's a gross conflation of all of these things. And of course, you know, Winston Churchill himself is probably one of the great conflators because, of course, in World War One, his great enemy was Prussian militarism. In World War Two, his great enemy was National Socialism. So in his mind, these two things emanating from the same place might as well be the same thing. But anyway, and of course, it wasn't as if there was any place for ideological nuance when you were fighting a war of annihilation. But I'll continue with this. The bombardment of Gießen meant absolutely nothing to the bombardier. He filed down towns of 47,027 air raids from September 1944 to March of 1945, and did not in any way imagine that this Hessian half-timbered town was a Nazi shrine. A small city was simply swept away because the bomber was a sweeper. 1/3 of the 250 Lancasters of No. 5 Bomber Group aimed for the railway yard on December the 6th, 1944, and 2/3 worked on the Old Town, which was lost a short time later. In contrast to the artful countenance of Potsdam, facades such as Hirsch's apothecary with the strange corner oriel, the old-fashioned professor's house, and a box with many windows that had once been a pedagogium, a preparatory boarding school, were a family album. Nothing but the stones had passed on the familiarity of distant places. They were found, transformed, left behind, and they set, in addition to a lifespan, a second measure of time. History is that second time. Stone gave it a physicality and structure. The 5th century city hall, with slated Renaissance gables and set on angular columns, the old castle at Brandplatz, the castle of the Hessian Landgrave with a keep from the 14th century that became a royal court in the 19th century and was later covered with Renaissance elements, the Burgmannenhaus of 1349. One of Hesse's oldest half-timber buildings, the Classicist Old Clinic of 1819, the Art Nouveau Theatre of 1906, they all communicated their origins, forms, and patinas were communicative even before any academic interpretation. They generated a sound the people could simply hear. Bomber Command eliminated this resonance in stone all across the country. Now it is all missing. Remote monuments and stone caves sheltered the movable art treasures. Without these evacuations, the cultural history stored in paper, wood, and canvas would have survived the air only in fragments. It was not always easy to determine what was stationary and what was portable. The Gothic sculptures on the pillars in the high choir of the Cologne Cathedral were not put there with any intention of their changing location before the Last Judgment. These finely modelled figures, weighing a ton, held themselves up, along with bedakins and consoles, with rusty old dowelled joints that could not be undone without breaking them. The sandbag packing that towered up on the wooden supports was both effective protection against fragments and a fire hazard. Replacing the planks with correspondingly steep, massive walling risked overloading the ground, which was hollow with crypts and vaults. A cathedral could be neither armoured nor dismantled. The monumental furnishings of the Baroque organ fronts, high reticles, heavy pulpits, and pews refused to be transported. That which served worship was as firm as the firmament and sought no other abode. The dowelled joints and timbering of the parts were built for eternity, and the totally rusted iron nails from the Middle Ages in the tannin of the old oak wood made it possible only to remove individual figures and diptychs, whereas the main structure was as movable as the pillars and the arches. Its stability also resisted being walled in. The wood required air circulation, but air holes drilled in the walled-in protective spaces created an oven effect. There was also a scarcity of work crews and experts to carry on these complex rescue operations. The call to arms left only aging guards at these sites. Nightly transportation or firefighting actions in burning church wings were beyond the realm of what was possible. In Dortmund, on the other hand, a 70-year-old cabinet maker appeared at the Church of St. Peter and knew how to dismantle the 5-ton carved Flemish altar. Before the First Battle of the Ruhr could destroy it, the altar travelled to a remote corner of the Weser Valley, and as luck would have it, the Weser was not flooded when the Eder Valley Dam was breached. In the Church of St. Peter, built in 1353, the direct hit which ripped apart the northern wall of the choir and all the vaults would certainly have destroyed it. The most endangered elements were the stained glass paintings in medieval churches. They shattered even if a bomb hit at a great distance. At the cathedrals in Cologne, Xanten, Altenburg, as well as in numerous cities and village churches, glass painters removed the old panes from their fittings and packed them into crates to be brought to dry cellars, first those from the Middle Ages and then those from the Renaissance. Having been made for the light, they turned milky and disintegrated at the slightest dampness. In all the Rhineland, by the middle of 1942, there was hardly any original glass still in its original fittings. At first, remote areas were sought to store the artwork, open countryside far from military and war-relevant facilities, from prominent points on the ground, and as close as possible to mountains and forests. Isolated fortresses and castles with solid outer walls and massive vaulted rooms were well suited as storerooms. Castles became less suitable after the beginning of the Fire War because of their enormous roof areas. Moated castles, on the other hand, had fabulous fire protection, reservoirs, though the dampness of their valley locations damaged stored items. The optimal site, a high fortified castle on steep cliffs, let bombs slide off and had good air circulation. Less useful were the lower ground floors of large hospitals and nursing homes because the heated rooms were bad for panel paintings and furniture accustomed to the cold. Concrete bunkers were useless because of condensation. When the air war extended to the rural quarters, it forced the objects of cultural value to travel even further into subterranean stone, casemates of fortresses and mining shafts and adits. When necessary, people managed to cope with the dampness and lack of ventilation, but carpets, tapestries, paints, paper would never adapt to such a climate. They rotted away from mildew, mold, moths, woodworms, and flies. Paintings had spent years protected from daylight lost their color. In order to stack artwork underground, humidity and ventilation had to be strictly controlled. The Erlenbreitstein fortress near Koblenz had already been set for archival storage before the war. On top of that came the inventories of the Berlin museums. Similar services were provided by underground installations in Nuremberg Castle. Berlin had originally planned to build subterranean bunkers for its inexhaustible assets, but followed the better advice of the General Director of Prussian State Archives in 1943. Disused salt and potash mash proved to be excellent sites for the storage of endangered cultural treasures. They were dry, clean, deep, and extended for miles. There were sufficient areas available in Württemberg, Baden, in Austria, the Potash Triangle in central Germany, between Hanover and Magdeburg. I think, the segment now goes on to Berlin State Archives and the preservation of books. But I think for the sake of brevity and time, I am going to leave this segment here and move on, if that's all right.
Yeah. So it's just a few comments. People may or may not know that I'm an artist, and so I also am an art historian. So I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the preservation of art, and so the rushed efforts to protect art often do end up causing more damage than leaving them in place. Although of course there's no way of telling beforehand which place is going to be spared and which isn't. And a lot of artworks are extremely delicate. Obviously, anything on cloth or paper or canvas, which is a large proportion of all cultural fine art products, is all subject to rot, to damp, to mildew. Stuff flakes, ink, and watercolor is sometimes not permanently fixed, so you put it in a humid condition and it will just start to creep. It will start to bloom, so you'll end up with lines bleeding and writing becoming indecipherable and so forth. And it's a huge problem. I mean, if you go to a museum, you'll find that they devote thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds to air conditioning and humidity controls and climate controls. So yes, this is a very important issue, and so it's natural that so much artwork was lost in an attempt to preserve it. I'll mention just very briefly the fate of the Klimt murals for the university in Vienna. He painted these controversial murals. They were rejected by the university. Klimt went on to keep them. They were passed on through different hands, and they ended up in the castle of Schloss Immendorf in Austria. And unfortunately, the departing Nazis burned it down. They set fire to the castle, and that was just one tragic loss. There were obviously tragic losses of many things, but this was considered to be a particularly bad loss because it seems apparently it was actually just completely gratuitous.
Thank you, Alexander. If it's all right, I will read one last segment, then I'll leave it to that, and then I want to briefly touch on Dresden and then talk about restoration efforts. Johann Jakob Fugger laid the foundation for the court library in Munich, which Elector Maximilian I, a friend of historiography, transformed from a collection into a source of scholarship, a place to store the knowledge of the age and of all ages. That required a central catalogue. Maximilian ordered the monasteries of the land, the oldest places of study, to submit a description of their manuscripts, to create a general index of all his libraries. As of 1663, a copy of every book printed in Bavaria or by a Bavarian author found a place in the court library. By around 1800, it contained about 100,000 volumes. 3 years later, the monasteries were suppressed, and their book and manuscript collections were carted to Munich, which soon also attracted the inventories of the cities that had previously been self-governing under the emperor and now belonged to Bavaria. Consequently, it became the largest collection of books in the German language. In the 18th century, the court library was located in 24 rooms of Fugger's palace. When new arrivals brought the total above the 1 million mark, the whole library was abandoned in favour of stacks in a new monumental building in the Ludwigstrasse. It survived the first 9 bombing raids on Munich without a scratch. On the night of Tuesday, March 9th, 1943, Bomber Command dropped 70,000 incendiary bombs on Munich. The attack started around midnight. The guards patrolled the attic storage space and removed about 30 magnesium alloy thermite sticks, almost as if they were performing a drill. At the same time, news came in that a large fire had started in the central building. They could hardly believe it. Since observers had gone through there 2 minutes earlier, in that time, a fire 50 feet across had developed. A little later, the entire area was in flames. The column of heat shot through the glass roof, creating a chimney, and a flame darted up 150 feet in the night sky. There was the work of liquid incendiaries at the most vulnerable point, where old-fashioned wooden structures and the glass roof virtually invited a major conflagration. A strong southwesterly wind bent the flames from the central building towards the northeast wing. The 6 defenders did all they could to keep the connecting line open between the 2 wings of the building and to block the flames from the northeastern tract. That meant sacrificing the theology room and its precious Bible collections at the axis of the complex. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the first fire engine arrived from the National Theatre. The staff escorted firefighters through the labyrinth of stairs and corridors and then turned their efforts to saving books. From 2 o'clock onwards, a growing troop of civilians and military gathered at the State Library, and by morning there were about 1,000 people. Thanks to these helpers, the manuscripts and the incubula, the music collection, the catalogue were removed in time. They were placed in the nearby St. Ludwig's Cathedral. In the early morning hours, the blaze seemed quenched. Dawn had not yet broken. The inner courtyard was filled with a chaos of hoses, pumps, and lines leading into the building and crawling up the stairways. The flames came to life, rebelled, turned against the northwest wing, and eradicated the whole second floor. The central section was still smouldering. Black clouds of smoke raced through the courtyard. The northwest wing was a torch glowing blindingly. The blaze of the library loomed up from the Ludwigstrasse into the dark sky. The south wind increased, sweeping down the breadth of the blaze and picking up burning and glowing scraps of books. A snow-like flurry of glowing bits of paper floated around the air. Down the street, between the library and St. Ludwig's, the book carriers scurried around with their arms full, all the while taking care that their clothing did not catch fire. In the dim aisle of the church, in nooks and altars, the mountains of rescued books grew. From 8 a.m., the fire died down a second time, but it fooled the firefighters yet again. A fire had lodged unnoticed on the false floor, and it flared up in the afternoon, took sudden hold of 2 rooms on the 3rd floor in the northwest wing, and devoured the North American collection and all the holdings on non-European geography, all of which had been considered safe. The last embers went out after 4 weeks. The inner courtyard had a mountain of 45,000 cubic yards of rubble, reaching up to the 2nd floor. The Bavarian State Library lost 500,000 books on the night of March the 9th, which was 23% of the total inventory. The subject areas affected were classical philology, archaeology and art history, theology and non-European geography. Irreplaceable was the complete collection of the academia, the publications of scholarly societies and academies. The total losses were comparable only to the burning of the library in Alexandria in the 3rd century. Only 4 months later, the state and university libraries in Hamburg lost 625,000 books. Never before in the history of humanity had so many books been burned. So in addition to the destruction of buildings, we're talking about the destruction of relics, we're talking about the destruction of manuscripts, the destruction of books. And I think just a last honorable mention before I invite your comments, Alexander, is things that couldn't be moved. So for example, in the medieval era, when we're conceiving of geography, we conceive of geography theologically. The world is centered around various, essentially, the medieval world saw Jerusalem at the center, and you conceive of this in the form of a mappa mundi, a map of the world. And such a map exists in Britain. At the top of my mind, I really should know, but the cathedral escapes me. But the largest of these medieval mappa mundis was in Ebsdorf. And that, of course, along with all the other cultural destruction, was, of course, destroyed during a bombing raid as well. Just a last honorable mention. But Alexander, last thoughts in terms of the specific destruction elements here.
Yes, terrible destruction, including lots of archives that we as an art historian, you're always looking for historical details about certain artists, and you often think, well, I often think, there's so much in those archives that were destroyed, even if it's just something as simple as a register of births or deaths, christenings, that in those records you find all sorts of valuable information, stuff that links artists to places, people to people, historic events, rulers, and so forth. And you lose all of that when that archive goes. And of course, that it's irreparable, and you don't know what you've lost. And that's one of the worst things, is you don't know exactly what information there was in there that has now been lost. So yes, it's a very sad story.
And again, I find it quite incredible that the only parallel that one can possibly draw to the scale of destruction is the destruction of the Alexandria Library. And again, the concerted attempts of destroying that library are often seen as synonymous with, even though I don't agree, the advent of the Dark Ages. But nevertheless, this to me is a significant indictment in terms of not just the war of annihilation on Germany, but just the war on sort of all relics and substance of the past. And regarding the Ebsdorf Mappamundi, again, referring to this schema of the medieval worldview, that dated to the 13th century. And as someone in the chat has mentioned, it is, of course, the English equivalent is the Hereford Mappamundi, just for completion's sake. So I want to come to Dresden, which we haven't really talked about, partly because it's been talked to death, but also we mentioned Potsdam, we mentioned Nuremberg. We haven't really mentioned the most obvious sites for destruction, Essen, Dortmund, cities on the Ruhr. We mentioned large metropolitan areas such as Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, Berlin. Dresden doesn't really fit into the pattern of all of these. In terms of industry, Dresden was I believe, qualified by RAF as the 7th largest industrial center in Germany. But in terms of any symbolic relevance to Dresden, it wasn't a Potsdam, it wasn't a Nuremberg, it wasn't a quote unquote center of demonic Nazism, it wasn't a center of Prussian militarism. In fact, if one is going to look at history, Dresden was the capital of the Kingdom of Saxony. The Kingdom of Saxony was the quintessential enemy of Prussia. It had been the enemy of Prussia since the 7 Years' War, when Frederick the Great tried to conquer it, and all attempts by Prussian kings over the next 100 years to attempt to reconquer it again, only to be finally stymied in 1868, when Wilhelm I, the first German emperor, was denied his wish by Bismarck to annex it finally. So Dresden remained a bastion of anti-Prussianism and a bastion of culture, because the city had mainly been redesigned by Augustus the Strong, the great elector at the beginning of the 18th century. And so it was one of the greatest examples of that transition between the Renaissance and the classical eras in German architecture. And of course, the skyline being dominated by the Lutheran and the Catholic cathedral, and this beautiful photochrome you see from 1900. So Dresden, therefore, stands out in terms of having very little in the way of a ideological reason for its destruction, based on all of these historical idiosyncrasies which contrast with other elements of German history. Of course, those elements of German history are inconvenient here when one is finding an ideological form of destruction. So in terms of my understanding of why Dresden in particular was singled out for such a massive attempt at destruction at such a delayed point in the war, because remember, this is March of 1945. A few weeks, literally less than 2 months' time, Germany would have surrendered. The official justification given by Bomber Harris, again, we're talking about Bomber Harris sustaining his position and power predicated on repeating a strategy of total annihilation, which had proven again and again to have failed. And it was only with Allied boots on the ground that the German right would finally collapse. So as for Dresden, the official justification was the complete and utter destruction of civilian infrastructure. Vast numbers of refugees are pouring in from Silesia, Eastern Pomerania, West Prussia, East Prussia, to come in through a nexus at Dresden before fleeing west, potentially to defect to the Western Allies rather than live under a potential zone of Soviet occupation, which was looking very likely in the spring of 1945. So the idea from Arthur Harris was that targeting Dresden would basically cripple Germany's infrastructure being overloaded by so many refugees. Of course, that didn't happen, and such a strategy would have only meant a massive loss of non-combatant life at a time when the Soviets were advancing, and therefore would only help the Soviets, which seems rather strange when we're beginning to see the rumblings of the Cold War as the Second World War is ending. So in terms of my trying to get my head around as to why this happened, because again, unless you're going into the whole theory that FDR was basically just an actor acting on behalf of Stalin. My theory has always been that, one, it was an act of deliberate destruction meant to deter the Soviets from reneging on the commitments they made a month previous at Yalta. But more than that, it was an attempt to destroy a potential asset for the Soviets in the Soviet demarcation zone, which will be confirmed at the Potsdam Conference later on in 1945. Rather than give a gift to the Soviets, it would be better just to burn everything down. And in a sense, if you're going to look at this strategically through that lens, beyond any ideology, we're now looking to the pure destruction of Germany from the sort of pre-Cold War perspective of realpolitik. What do you think of that view?
As I heard it, yes, it was because it was a major transport intersection for the rail network, and that the destruction of this or the crippling of this would have impaired the movement of men and material, I suppose also of refugees. And I thought that there was a secondary consideration that Meissen, the Meissen Works, which was a famous porcelain works factory, was involved in the production of isolators, porcelain isolators, which are used in sort of electrical distribution, insulation, basically. So you'll see those things hanging from electrical wires, and they've got these sort of ceramic, white ceramic connections and so forth. I heard that was one of the reasons why it was done, but obviously, I mean, that's just so minor. You can't really. I'm fully prepared to believe what you've told me.
And just to reiterate, we're talking about again anything from 25,000 victims over a course of 3 days upwards. And as I said, given the severity of the bombing, it just seems completely unnecessary, and I can only assume it in terms of the again, given the ideological contradictions, that this city was targeted purely for the aforementioned reasons. Again, corresponding with the Yalta conference, because again, coming back to you see, Iron Duke, I don't believe, as confused and muddled as Churchill's strategic planning was, I do believe that this was a direct attack, almost a show of force before the Soviet Union, rather than simply at the behest of the Soviet Union, because
they would be going directly into this territory, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would. But more than that, at the Potsdam Conference, I believe, happened the day after the Trinity test, the first test of the nuclear bomb, which Truman could use as an ace up his sleeve in terms of the negotiations. And the Yalta Conference was held around the time of the bombing of Dresden. To my mind, Trinity and the bombing of Dresden are both corresponding in terms of their attempts to nudge the Soviets into a more conciliatory position, especially regarding the post-war situation in Poland, whether there is going to be any attempt at a Soviet retreat in Poland and the return of the government in exile back to Poland rather than the creation of a Soviet-backed regime, which ultimately would happen. All of these things were still very much in the open. It wouldn't be until 1947, 1948 that we see the consolidation of a Soviet empire in Eastern Europe. So all of these things need to be considered. And for that reason, we're moving beyond the apocalyptic imagery for the sake of wiping Sodom and Gomorrah off the face of the map. And we're talking about destruction for the sake of realpolitik. Now, one of the reasons I really wanted to have you for this discussion, Alexander, and again, I think Dee would have also been wonderful for this, is just to have a short epilogue now regarding you can say the justification, the scale, and also the quality of reconstruction efforts. Now, since 1990, Germany has been reunified. Many of these areas during the DDR period in German history, during the German Democratic Republic, not only was the destruction sort of basically these ruined structures existed for decades after the wars in East Germany, but in many cases ruined buildings themselves were destroyed. One of the most famous examples being the City Palace in Berlin that was demolished to make place for a communist legislature, which was then itself demolished to make way for a restoration of the City Palace.
So this is so that's essentially what and there was the Royal Palace, that's the Hohenholzen Palace in the center of Berlin. This was on the museum's Insel, so right at the center, right next to the Berliner Dom, which is the Berlin Cathedral. It was damaged during the war. It stood until the early 1950s when it was eminently repairable, but it was deliberately demolished by the communists as a sort of anti-royalist statement, essentially. And on its site was built the Palast der Republik, which was a glass and steel monstrosity. I'm not automatically opposed to brutalism. This was fairly undistinguished, but it was actually quite well regarded by Berliners because although it was technically it was a legislature, it was a rubber stamp parliament, so they didn't actually have to gather very much for and so people had access, ordinary Berliners had access to cinemas, theaters, cafes. There's a bowling alley, I think, and it was quite affectionately thought of. So as soon as unification came around and the Westerners and it was essential, and you have to think about unification as being the subsuming of the GDR into the FDR, into the German Republic, the West German Republic. So East Germany essentially ceases to exist. It wasn't unification; it was a takeover. And so once the West Germans had their hands on the Palast der Republik, it was gone. They apparently discovered it had asbestos, and the only way to remove asbestos, as you all know, is to entirely demolish the whole building, which is what they proceeded to do. And the final chapter is that they have rebuilt a version of the Royal Palace, which is the Asian Museum, the museum for the it's the museum for the city's collection of essentially East Asian art. And that has been, so the exterior is the same as the Royal Palace, but the interior, I believe, is different.
See, this is an interesting point regarding Soviet reconstruction and reconstruction in the Federal Republic, whether it existed simply as the Bonn Republic in the West or the United Republic post 1990, because we talked earlier about the designs of the National Socialist Speer and Hitler to rebuild the cities from the ruins into the megalomaniacal structures of Speerian architecture, Germania, or Hitler's new project in Linz and the Danube. Well, the socialists, as is probably appropriate, had the same idea. they saw the destruction of the churches in Dresden, the garrison church, say, for example, in Potsdam, with great glee, because, of course, the Soviets and the Socialist Unity Party in East Germany were atheists and despised this whole history of Prussian militarism,
Yes.
albeit their attitude towards German nationalism is a bit confused and would be a subject to another stream. But they saw the destruction of Dresden as a means of restoring the city along socialist planning. And of course, you have these horrific 1960s buildings, a new Dresden City Hall, if I remember correctly, the Pinaische Platz, and as with the city palace, we have a socialist reconstruction, which was resulted in the Palace of the People, and after 1990. The socialist reconstruction gives way to a reconstruction of the Saxon Baroque. What are your thoughts on the restoration of Dresden?
Yes, I've visited Dresden a couple of times. I didn't spend as much time there as I wanted to. The reconstruction of the Baroque Centre is good. It's fairly persuasive. I mean, obviously, you look at the buildings and you know that they're not 400 years old, because obviously they're too fresh. But they have been relatively faithful about reproducing as they could. And I think it was the best thing to do. I don't think that, especially for a city that is as unique and as important as Dresden, I think that you should make an effort to try and retain, or in this case, it would be to rebuild, because there really wasn't very much to retain. And I applaud what they've done. It's obviously you have this problem of that sort of uncanny valley feeling that you're in a historical place, but it's been reconstructed. So you're thinking, well, this is like being in Disneyland, or it's like being in one of those Chinese theme parks where they sort of build a little English village for tourists to wander around. And there are certainly enough tourists in Dresden, but I think they did pretty well. And also, you have to bear in mind that when the reconstruction of cities like Berlin, East and West, occurred, the West were not they used a system called Plattenbau, which is basically you build a structure and then you slot in precast walls and windows and stuff, and you slot them in, and it's like a sort of a giant not Meccano set, but sort of a slot system. And this was used both in the West and the East. So although East gets a lot of stick for having concrete buildings, which are now afflicted by concrete cancer, which is essentially corrosion, the West was doing it just as much. And there are as many ugly buildings in West Berlin as there are in East Berlin. So I take it with a grain of salt that the East were particularly bad. They were particularly bad with regard to churches. They were not good with those, but to be fair, the East Germans did do quite a good job on restoring the palaces the palaces and castles of Potsdam, even if they weren't terribly keen on doing anything about the garrison church.
There's one last. I mean, you've already briefly mentioned Frankfurt, but just obviously we can't go around talking about all of the reconstruction efforts in the same way that we can only talk about so much of the original destruction events. But what are your thoughts pertaining to the new Frankfurt Old Town?
I can't remember that much of it. It was, again, I mean, they tried something like that in Berlin with the Nikolai Viertel, which was a sort of notable failure. I can tell you that the rest of Frankfurt is pretty bad. It's essentially been completely rebuilt, and you have giant tower blocks. You have office buildings because it's a banking center, and it's lost most of its character. From what I remember of the old town in Frankfurt, it's it's adequate, but it certainly hasn't got the charm of Dresden.
I think that's a good place really to leave this this conversation. We're 3.5 hours in. So, Alexander, before I get to the super chats, don't worry, we only have 3. Would you like to say anything in summation regarding the scouring of Germany?
Yes, I think it's a huge topic, and it's something of an iceberg, that it's not something that comes up very much when you discuss this with Germans, because I lived there for a long time, and this would come up occasionally, and they were sort of slightly unwilling to talk about it, as sort of a sense of, well, everyone suffered in the war. Why should we Germans claim any particular distinction in suffering? But obviously, it's when you have these injuries, these psychological injuries, they carry on existing underneath the surface, and if they're not talked about and if people can't be honest with them, they do start to distort history, and they distort people's responses to their own pain and the pain of their people. So I think it's an unhealthy situation, and that Germans should feel more able to talk about these things.
And this, of course, relates back to what was quoted at the very beginning of the stream regarding a collective, almost intentional amnesia surrounding this, and the effects of destruction, cultural elimination, an erasure of history, and the effects of prolonged occupation and integration into basically 2 cultures, Soviet and West, that were responsible for dismantling and conquering Germany in 1945. I'm going to be very, very, very cynical here, and I think that the only way that this is going to change, this consideration, I mean, obviously the academic literature and the arguments pertaining to the moral validity of the bombing continues, and especially in England, it's being talked about. It's been weirdly in the context of the fact that we were responsible for Arthur Harris, but nevertheless, I think the only way that this is going to be acceptable within mainstream German parlance is if I don't know, the Germans are allowed to stoke nationalistic feelings against the Russians, but even then, this doesn't really equate to a reconciliation of the German victimhood during the bombings, because the Soviets weren't the ones primarily responsible for the bombings. It was the Allies. So even within the context of a rejuvenated German nationalism, unless it's a rejuvenated German nationalism against the Western Allies, I don't believe there's going to be any ideological and political context in which a mass awakening regarding the events of Dresden et al. Is going to enter the mainstream consciousness, which is very strange, but nevertheless, that is the bizarre and unfortunate predicament that modern Germany finds itself in. All right. I'll just read quickly through these super chats, right? The Lizard Viking for €5. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I cannot watch the stream right now. I just want to show my support for your channel. Keep up the good work. Well, that's very much appreciated, Liz. Thank you. Vingol for, I believe that's Norwegian krone. I can't quite remember. 100. Thank you very much. If I may, there's an insightful 1963 essay by a former British intelligence officer, RHS Crossman, titled Apocalypse at Dresden. George Bagby did a 45-minute reading of it for my channel. Thanks for the stream, and thank you very much, Fingal, for your super chat and for bringing that up. I didn't actually know you had a channel, Vingal, so do everyone check out Vingal's channel and the reading. So thank you very much. Darth Kilhoon for $2. Great stream about the genocide from 10,000 feet. I mean, I'm reluctant to use such words as genocide because they've become very loaded, and in a contemporary setting, it's all of these terms are charged, and I like very precise meanings with the terminology used. But I like associations with the apocalypse and wars of annihilation and firestorms. because as much as this could be seen as a war waged on the non-combatant German population, I see it as more than that. I see it as genocidal in the sense that you are trying to wipe out German history, not just the German populations. I mean, in terms of the actual deaths that are a result of this, the German non-combatant death rate is nothing compared to, say, for example, the Soviet civilian death toll, which is anything up to about 10 million people, and another 10 million if you add all the Red Army war casualties. So by contrast, if we're tallying up the dead, 600,000 doesn't seem very much, but why Germany sticks out is the sheer scale of the destruction of nearly all of its major urban centers, which of course didn't happen in the Soviet Union, partly because so many of the eastern Siberian cities in the Soviet Union were beyond the reach of any bombers, and indeed would actually account for many of the larger Soviet cities within the Muscovite interior. So that is why a Scouring of Germany is so unique and particular in this sense. Even though the casualties were horrific, it was more a war which has been waged on German history with certain ideological attempts to erase aspects of German Prussian militarism and National Socialism, as with Nuremberg and Potsdam. Darth Kilhoun for $2. Sorry, I've already read that one. Lady of Shalott for $5 Australian. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for discussing this sensitive topic. How do Germans feel about Dresden now? Are they angry at the loss of cultural legacy? Well, any anger directed at the loss at Dresden. I mean, Dresden is one of the few targets which is permissible to lament and talk about, partly because it occurred so late in the war and it was a target with such limited strategic utility in targeting. And for that reason, Dresden holds a special place when in reality Hamburg was the more devastating when we look at the loss of life. That is why, and again for the reasons we mentioned about the ideological contradistinction between Dresden and say a Nuremberg or a Potsdam, why Dresden is almost sort of beyond the list of all the other German cities.
Sorry. Yeah, I would agree, and I would say that the Germans they do talk about Dresden, and it is still a live issue, and I think that there is some anger there, and I think it's worth thinking about the fact that the only time I ever saw any sort of right-wing demonstrations in the whole of Germany in the time that I lived there, which was a little while back now, it was in Dresden. And I think that's why you find that there is so much support for the AfD, for example, in East Germany. So, and I think it's connected with this sort of thing.
And I think for that reason, there are going to be a lot more articles written, not just in German, but in Western media, saying that any veneration or veneration of the victims of Dresden, or any attempts at saying that Dresden was a war cry, is just a far-right dog whistle, or National Socialist sympathy, or anything to do with that, because it is going to be intimately associated with the rise of the AfD in the polling. So that's something else to point out. Anything that could possibly be a cause célèbre for neo-Nazism, of course, it doesn't matter how historically justified it would be. If there is that association, it will be eliminated from the collective consciousness, I'm afraid. Right. Holly Weather for $2 Australian. Thank you very much. A wonderful stream as always. Thank you. Well, that's very kind of you, Holly Weather. Right. That's the end of the super chats. Alexander, thank you very much for coming on. Is there anything you would like to shill or say before we close tonight's discussion?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for asking me on AM. It's been it has been an enjoyable discussion, even though, of course, it's been, very sobering, and it's a big topic. And yes, so thank you very much for asking me that. Thank you for the chat and for everyone who's contributed there. If you're interested in me, you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Adams Artist. You can also support my work by reading and becoming a paid subscriber, although there is unpaid content on alexanderadamsart.substack.com. If any of you are minded, on Sunday, the 1st of October, I'm launching a new series of 3 lino cuts of notable reactionary and conservative writers on Imperium Press. So if you go to Imperium Press and then go to merchandising, you'll see on Sunday 3 new prints. Previously we had Carlyle, Junger, and de Maistre. I can give you an exclusive reveal that one of the authors that will be launched on Sunday will be a portrait of Julius Evola.
Thank you very much for that, Alexander. And again, thank you so much for coming on. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to those who left a super chat. It's very, very much appreciated. I'm not sure when the next live stream will be. It'll probably be in about 3 weeks' time, when I'm having Semigog and Academic Agent on to continue the history of today's series. We're going to be talking about the legacy of the British Empire. All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.